Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I am not your host for today, Dr. John DeLynn. Why are you laughing? You are in for a very special treat today. What's the date? It's April 11th. April 11th, 2026. And we are here for another LDS Discussions episode. And what's super exciting is a random combination of events made it such that probably for the only time in the history of LDS Discussions, past, present, or future, will we have all members of the LDS Discussions crew in studio at the same time. So believe it or not, today in studio we have the rando on the internet, Colby Reddish. Hey, Colby.
Hey, good morning, John. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. You're joining us from Boise originally, but you're here in Salt Lake City in studio. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, of course.
All Happy our best to Cam.
Yeah, thank you.
And believe it or not, Julia drove with her family all the way from Missouri to Salt Lake City to record this episode. So we have Julia in studio.
Hi.
Thanks for coming, Julia.
Yeah, of course.
Last time I saw you was like right before you moved to Missouri.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Is that right? Or
well, I've lived in Missouri, but I came up to
move back, right?
Yeah, probably. Something like that. But
anyway.
yeah, that was a long time ago.
It's good to have you.
Yeah.
It's good to have you in studio.
Thanks.
And believe it or not, we're pulling a rabbit out of the hat. We have all the way from across the pond, Nemo the Mormon, here in studio joining us on the LDS Discussions team. What's up, Nemo?
Not much. It's great to be here.
What the heck are you doing in Utah?
Having a great time.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to have you. And I'll just say it. LDS Discussions has been chugging along without me, and I'm super happy that's happening. And so I'm going to play a very minor role in today's episode. I wouldn't have even been introducing except Colby asked me to. Right, Colby?
Yeah, I may have fumbled it the first time, the first take, which is why we opened with a little bit of laughter. But I do think it's funny now with Nemo here with us in studio. This episode is literally an international incident. So,
Well, we have a lot of those these days. And so let's do it. Let's have an international incident on Mormon Stories. But take it away, Colby.
Perfect. So our topic for today's episode is discussing what the Book of Mormon says about Reformed Egyptian, and then analyzing those claims in the same way we've looked at, different episodes regarding the stone box, or looking at other things about the historical claims that the Book of Mormon or that Mormon leaders have made. And so we're going to look at Reformed Egyptian and what the Book of Mormon says about that, because for the Book of Mormon to exist, its claims that it makes about Reformed Egyptian must be literally historically true. And so that's one of the reasons that this episode has been something I thought about doing for a long time. And we kind of have talked about doing this in the context of other episodes. So when we start talking about the Book of Mormon, I think one of the ways that's important to frame this episode is that the Book of Mormon, when it makes claims about the reason the Book of Mormon exists or the way that the Book of Mormon was written, those things must be literally true for the Book of Mormon to exist in the way that we have it today. And so if we can pull up the slides, we'll look at that first claim that the Book of Mormon makes about itself. Nemo, would you mind reading? This comes from the Book of Mormon's, there's an entry in the Book of Mormon about the Book of Mormon, and this comes from that page in the Book of Mormon.
Okay. So the original title page immediately preceding the contents page is taken from the plates and is part of the sacred text. Introductions in a non-italic typeface, such as in 1 Nephi and immediately preceding Mosiah chapter 9, are also part of the sacred text. Introductions in italics, such as in chapter headings, are not original to the text, but are study helps included for convenience in reading. And that's from the Book of Mormon's page titled A Brief Explanation About the Book of Mormon.
It is. And so this hooks in very closely to something that Joseph Smith said in History of the Church. He said that the title page of the Book of Mormon is a literal translation taken from the very last leaf on the left-hand side of the collected book of plates, which contain the record which has been translated, the language of the whole running the same as all Hebrew writing, in general, that is from right to left, and that said title page is not by any means a modern composition, either of mine or of any other man who has lived or does live in this generation. And so these are important kind of stepping stones to understanding the framing of today's episode, which is we are seeing this movement from certain apologists that the Book of Mormon can still be scripture or can still be inspired, even if it is not a literal translation of historical events. And of course, in this series, we don't try and speak for the conclusion that people should reach. But one of the things I do think is interesting is that apologetic attempt really disagrees with what Joseph Smith said about the Book of Mormon, and the way that Joseph Smith did very much view the Book of Mormon as being literally historically accurate and true. Nemo and Julia, do you have any framing you would add as we start to jump into these claims the Book of Mormon makes about itself?
No, I would perhaps say that in similar ways to the book's claims about where it took place, I think this is another example of where very clear and obvious things about the Book of Mormon have had to be made more opaque by certain apologists to try and hold on to the idea that the Book of Mormon is still true and is still scripture and those sorts of things, in the same way as we find a distinct lack of archaeological evidence for certain events in the Book of Mormon, so then we have to change where they may have happened, even though Joseph Smith believed they happened in a very specific place and all his contemporaries did. Similarly, you're going to have to start disagreeing with the Book of Mormon itself to try and explain away some of these issues. And I always think it's worth highlighting that that is what apologists are willing to do. They're willing to disagree with Scripture. They're willing to disagree with the founder of the church. They're willing to disagree with modern prophets, if necessary, to try and make an argument work. And then you have to decide who you want to believe, I suppose, or who you want to listen to, apologists or those other people.
Mm-hmm. Julia, any opening from you?
I just wanted to say, I really like Dr. Lundwall's episode that he just did on Mormon Stories. And he talks about this idea, and I think this could be one of the questions that we talk about today too, is the difference between the tight versus loose translation. Mm-hmm. And I made a little short where he says, what is a loose translation? And he says, you can translate loosely green eggs and ham into the Book of Mormon. So it's if you're either translating or you're not. And so I just think just the study of text and things like that is just go back and watch that episode. It's really, really good.
I completely agree. And I agree, Julia, that this episode will hook in very well to what Dr. Lundwall has said. That is something we always talk about with regard to the LDS discussion series in particular, is each of these episodes builds on each other. So this very much hooks into our episode we did earlier about the brass plates and what it means about the Great Isaiah Scroll. So it's important to remember that this series is best consumed in order. And yes, it does also hook into Dr. Lundwall's recent episode talking about basically the text itself as an anachronism. So it does build on itself there.
And people can watch this series on Spotify as its own series under the LDS Discussions name. The Mormon Stories podcast YouTube channel has its own playlist called LDS Discussions. You can check it out on Apple Podcasts as well. But those are the ways to consume this series in sequence, and you'll just get the most out of it. Okay, back to you.
Perfect. And so I think to continue on with our framing before we really talk about the problem that the Book of Mormon's claims pose for viewing it as a literal historical record, we started by introducing, where the Book of Mormon comes from, how it was compiled by looking at its explanation about itself. And one of the things that Nemo read for us is that the Book of Mormon has the title page, which Joseph Smith claimed was part of the original plates, that it was translated by him directly, that it was the last thing he translated. So if we can pull up the next slide, Nemo, we'll look at that title page. And I don't think we'll read all of this in particular, but what we will do is we'll just show that the title page itself makes really particular claims. And it's very clear that those claims really foreclose the recent apologetic attempts to say that, maybe the Book of Mormon can continue to still be a revelation, at least in the view that the way Joseph Smith understood what he was doing is that it was a literal translation of an ancient record. And so the title page itself, starts by saying it is an abridgment of a record of the people of Nephi and also of the Lamanites, written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel, and also to Jew and Gentile, written by way of commandment, and also by the spirit of prophecy and revelation, written and sealed up and hid up unto the Lord, that they might not be destroyed. And I'll just go ahead and read that far, because I think what it really helps show is where the Book of Mormon comes from. Nemo, would you help kind of, for readers who may not have listened to our past episodes on the brass plates and Mormon and Moroni's involvement in the Book of Mormon, can you just give us the standard kind of seminary answer of where the Book of Mormon itself came from, like how it was actually produced?
Mm-hmm. So the Book of Mormon is a collection of ancient records. It's the histories of a people, which was discussed in Dr. Lundwall's episode about oral histories versus written histories. But it's the idea that ancient Jewish people, Lehi and his family, got records that contain parts of the books, the ancient books of scripture of the Jewish people, Moses' Exodus into the wilderness, those sorts of things. Took them to America, kept their own records. There was also records found of another people that went to America. And over time, they were preserved and kept and added upon until you've got Mormon and Moroni who take them, they abridge those records, all these things that have been kept, put them into a volume, seal that volume up by burying it, and wait for Joseph Smith to pick it up and find it. And they engrave it onto plates for longevity's purposes, because gold doesn't tarnish.
Yeah. And if you're curious about what was in the stone box that contained the plates, we recently did an episode on that. That was our last entry in the LDS Discussion series. Yeah. So I think that's the way that everybody kind of understood it, is that the Book of Mormon is this compilation of records, and that Mormon and Moroni really served as that abridging function. So if we can look at the...
I'm really wishing that somehow we could have just incorporated John's recent episode, Lundwall, we could have incorporated that into the LDS Discussion series, because just the idea of a title page being written somewhere between 400 BC and 600 AD, it must have been the first title page ever written in the history of humankind, because books like this didn't exist even as late as 600 AD. And yet we've got Moroni or whoever engraving a title page into the golden plates.
And a title page that looks exactly like a contemporary title page from Joseph Smith's time period, I would add.
I'll never look at the Book of Mormon again after John Lundwall's episode, right?
Yeah, and I think this episode, kind of in a different way, but in a similar way, this episode poses a similar problem, because if you'll pull up the next slide, there are two graphics I wanted to talk about here. So that figure on the left is what's known as an Ouroboros. It's a mythological symbol where, you've got the snake eating its own tail. On the right, I've got Mormon or Moroni, I don't care which, basically disappearing, almost like the Back to the Future problem, right? Mm-hmm. So John, you remember the cinematic classic Back to the Future, where Marty McFly has to go back to the future, and as he's in the past, he's trying to solve these issues. At one point, there's a photograph that's disappearing of him and his siblings because he's basically undoing the future. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this episode, is the Book of Mormon makes very particular claims about the information density of Reformed Egyptian and Hebrew. And when we examine those claims closely, they just don't match up. And those claims, because they're claims that have to do exactly with where the Book of Mormon came from, have to be literally true for the Book of Mormon to exist. So that's why I focused on those two graphics. We've got a snake eating its own tail, and we've got Mormon or Moroni basically disappearing, because what the book says about Mormon and Moroni and the reasons that they're writing the Book of Mormon just simply are not borne out in reality. And we're going to go through in detail and basically show that. Any other introductory comments? Nemo, you looked like you were dying to say something.
Nope.
No, it's just that stoic British face, I think.
It is.
Yeah. Perfect. So let's look at the very particular verses that kind of frame this problem. So in the Book of Mormon, which is a book inside the Book of Mormon, so this is where Mormon and his son Moroni, I think for a portion of it, are basically sharing, their experience with the plates, keeping their record. And this is in Mormon chapter 9. Julia, would you be able to read the scriptures on Mormon chapter 9?
I also did bring my scriptures too, but I can just use my phone. So the first one?
Yes.
Condemn me not because of mine imperfections, neither my Father because of his imperfections, neither them who have reigned before him, but rather give thanks unto God, that he hath made manifest unto you our imperfections, that ye may learn to be more wise than we have been.
Okay, can we pause there for a second? I just have to observe how interesting it is that the author of this passage repeatedly starts out basically pre-apologizing for any weaknesses or imperfections that are going to be found in the record.
Which is a really interesting position for the editor of a record to take. It's like it is entirely within his power for those things to not exist within this record. He's taking the effort. Yeah, he's taking the effort to engrave this stuff on gold plates. He can undo mistakes. He can catch his mistakes. Maybe it comes from a place of, I might miss a little thing here or there, but it just feels like a really odd place to start for the person who's putting together a permanent version of these things.
I was also thinking of the repetition. He could have just said, don't Don't get onto me for my father's and people before me's mistakes, and make it a lot more.
Yeah, but
he's engraving, right?
Plenty of room on these plates. Plenty of information can be captured in one symbol, Julia. That's what we're getting into. That's barely a brush stroke, what we've just read. Or a stylus movement, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes ahead and continues. I'll read the next verse and then we can get any thoughts on this one. And now behold, we have written this record according to our knowledge in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. So this is where the Book of Mormon tells us that it's written in this script known as Reformed Egyptian. Now, there is no such language. That's one of the biggest problems
that we know of.
That we know of. That's
I'm
true.
joking. I did ask Robert Rinder, does Reformed Egyptian exist?
If we just hold out hope a little bit longer, maybe we'll find that Reformed Egyptian. Now, there are obviously different versions of Egyptian. So Egyptian, and we'll touch on this a little bit more in detail here in a minute, but we have different forms of Egyptian. We have hieroglyphic, which is what people are most often going to be familiar with, right? That was originally etched on temple walls and had to do with rituals and with really their view of the afterlife. That hieroglyphic language then was simplified to hieratic and then further simplified to like a cursive form of hieroglyphics known as demotic. So there are different versions of Egyptian, and that's often what apologists will point to is, what do you mean there's no such thing as Reformed Egyptian? We have these other languages. Now, what we don't have is a language the way that the Book of Mormon claims that Reformed Egyptian was developed. The other thing I think is interesting is that the author of Mormon 9, whether it's Mormon, Moroni, or Joseph Smith, whichever particular view you want to take, is again, we're seeing this pre-apologetic effect, right? He's saying that the characters have been altered by us according to our speech. So you can see already he's building in this idea, if someone were to basically fact check what he's saying here, that the fact checking isn't going to it isn't going to bear out, and he's already making an excuse for that on the front end.
Yeah, because he's saying it's our special secret language that you wouldn't know about. He's like that friend that goes to another school, you wouldn't know him. But it's interesting that he says according to our manner of speech. It feels like if you take the view that Joseph Smith dictated this text orally, it feels like he's kind of telling on himself almost, because why would a pictographic language or a symbolic language that contains vast paragraphs of meaning per symbol be altered in any way by the way people speak?
Yeah.
Why would that make a difference? Why is that a valid excuse there, saying that, okay, well, according to the way we speak, according to the way we project our voices, the way we use our lungs, our diaphragm, whatever, that makes a big difference to the way that we write things down pictographically and the amount of text that we can get into one of those little symbols.
Wait, I want to just push back for a second, just so I understand. Not push back, but so did Nephi, because I'm thinking of what would have to happen in order to create the Book of Mormon. Did Nephi speak the language and write down in the plates the same language that Mormon and Moroni would have written down? Because in actually, 1 Nephi 1, he talks about the language of the Egyptians. He doesn't say reformed.
Right. I was going to say, actually, the very next verse, I think, adds some clarity on this. So it says, and this is really where we get the position that this author of Mormon 9 takes about this information density issue. It says, and if our plates had been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew. But the Hebrew hath been altered by us also. And if we could have written in Hebrew, behold, you would have had no imperfection in our record.
Really problematic.
Yeah, this is...
Keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
we're all laughing.
No, it's completely fine. It's because areas like this where we start to look at the seams of the Book of Mormon, like where the different parts are put together, I think like Nemo used the phrase, I think Joseph Smith is telling on himself a little bit. And that's basically my position in this episode, is that if you look carefully at what's being said here, it's kind of patently ridiculous, even if you take it at face value. It's saying that they wrote in Reformed Egyptian because there wasn't enough space for Hebrew. That's actually the purpose of today's episode, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But it's worth observing that it says that they'd altered the Reformed Egyptian, as Nemo said, according to their manner of speech. And then it says, but the Hebrew hath been altered by us also. And if we could have written in Hebrew, behold, you would have had no imperfection in our record. So to your question, Julia, of how would Nephi 1,000 years earlier, roughly 1,000 years earlier, have been writing in any type of language that would have been understood by Mormon and Moroni? Well, Mormon and Moroni see the same exact issue, because they're saying that all of these things have been altered. And it continues and gets even worse. But the Lord knoweth the things which have been written, and also that none other people knoweth our language. And because that none other people knoweth our language, therefore he hath prepared means for the interpretation thereof. So what it's really saying to me is don't fact check any of this because only God can tell you how this is going to work.
Trust me, bro. I got this.
It is, yes.
Yeah,
Wait, I have more questions too. But
can I just throw something in real quick?
Yeah.
I think what we've got here is Joseph Smith teeing up this idea that this is unintelligible, this is ungettable, it's untranslatable without God. Therefore, you've got to believe me.
Unfalsifiable.
Yeah, it's
right?
that's the convenient part of that, is that it's unfalsifiable. But you've got Joseph saying, hey, look, this is something no one else would know. So if some expert comes along and says this isn't a real language, well, of course he's not going to know. But I know because God told me. So this is almost, if you believe that Joseph Smith wrote this is Joseph Smith teeing himself up as the only possible person that could have brought this forward.
Exactly.
That's what he's writing this in for.
Okay, I just have other questions too, and they just emphasize, I think, what you just said. So, like, I think in the scriptures, you have Mosiah, I think, and you have Jesus, and they're all saying, like, study the words of Isaiah. What language is Isaiah written in for them? Is it written in Hebrew? Is it written in Reformed Egyptian? Is Reformed Egyptian just... Like, I'm confused
So when
by
Nephi's saying that he read the words of Isaiah and they brought him much joy, so that's why he wrote them in himself, right? Because in 2 Nephi he writes vast swathes of
The brass
Isaiah,
plates
right?
would have been written in Hebrew, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
But, like,
Except for the fact that they didn't write on plates back
And
when.
Right.
except for the fact that when we looked at the brass plates, or what the brass plates would have had in them relative to the Great Isaiah scroll, the brass plates always tracked, like the Isaiah verses in the Book of Mormon is what I'm really saying. The Isaiah verses in the Book of Mormon literally included the word Lucifer, so which was a Greek word, and so it would not have been written in Hebrew because it wasn't a Hebrew word, and yet we find it in the Book of Mormon.
Neither is the word adieu, which I think Jacob says.
Adieu, yeah, it's French.
Adieu.
My question is, I think he's telling the people to study the scriptures, but they couldn't have studied from the brass plates, right? There's only one set of brass plates, so like, are there scrolls? Are those written in Hebrew?
I bet they had a printing press. It just disappeared somehow, right?
Yeah, and Gutenberg had to
probably burnt it
reinvent
down.
it.
I guess that's another point as I was making is that, like, why is there no evidence of Hebrew or this type of Hebrew or Reformed Egyptian?
In all of the Americas,
Right, exactly.
there's no evidence of any Hebrew ever, nor any Egyptian or Reformed Egyptian
Right,
ever, right?
exactly. Yeah, that's another question.
I think you all are just being a little too skeptical because verses 17 and 18 continue and they say, speaking directly to the three of you, and if there be faults, they be the faults of a man. But behold, we know of no fault. Nevertheless, God knoweth all things. Therefore, he that condemneth, let him be aware, lest he shall be in danger of hellfire. And he that saith, show unto me, or ye shall be smitten, let him beware, lest he commandeth that which is forbidden of the Lord. So we're seeing what I would say a lot of pre-apologizing and explaining around these plot holes right there on the front end.
And if you disagree, then you're damned.
Then you're going to go to hell. That's right.
But isn't it interesting there? It's like, don't ask for a witness. I mean, I'll provide witnesses and we'll treat them like that's a really important way of knowing this is true. But don't you ask for a witness, because even if you did, you wouldn't believe it, as Ballard has gone on to say. Mm-hmm. Again, it's a problem with evidences. He's like, well, actually, if you want evidence, too bad you can't have it, because only the special people that have spiritual witnesses get special evidence that you've got to believe.
So, I mean, is Occam's razor sort of say that Joseph Smith had to claim that he was translating an ancient record because that's his gift of seership, but he couldn't do just regular old Egyptian because, he could have been disproven at some point, and he couldn't do Hebrew because he didn't know Hebrew, and he could have been disproven. So he had to manufacture some language that no one could ever
Well, because we've seen what happens when he does claim to translate Egyptian. It gets fact-checked and he was wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess the way I see it is he can't make the claim that the plates were written directly in Hebrew because there's still people who speak Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And so that could have been fact-checked. Yeah. But in the the late 1820s, 1830, Joseph Smith can't be fact-checked on Egyptian. Egyptian was the famously unknowable arcane language. So even though the Rosetta Stone was discovered right around the same time that Joseph Smith is translating the Book of Mormon, the code really wasn't cracked. A lot of people don't understand this. The code really wasn't cracked until like fuller until like the 1850s. So it started with Champollion and with other scholars who were working on cracking the Rosetta Stone, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it really wasn't finished, and we could actually translate Egyptian until after Joseph
So why
Smith.
didn't he just say Egyptian? Why did he say Reformed Egyptian
Well,
if he's making it up?
I think that goes to Julia's questions earlier about the link between the Hebrew and the Egyptian, and what's in First Nephi is Joseph needs to create a language that makes sense for a Hebrew-speaking people, or for someone from Jerusalem to be speaking. And the way that Reformed Egyptian is described in the Book of Mormon and First Nephi is that it is using Egyptian characters, but using the Hebrew language. That's my understanding.
And so what Joseph's playing on here is this idea that languages change over time. And so, I mean, and I'm giving him a lot of credit here that he might have been thinking this, but this idea that languages change over time. So if I have a distinct group of people that have moved to a different continent untouched by others, then their language will change and evolve over time, and it will be different. So we would expect that. So if you give him a lot of credit, that's a plausible idea. But then what you'd have to show is a version of Hebrew that is consistent with the way that other languages change. You'd be seeing something more like Swiss German to German rather than, Reformed Egyptian or just whatever the Hebrew ended up being.
Right. And I think what's ironic is that in trying to make that explanation, which I think is what Joseph is doing, he introduces a whole separate problem, which is he's saying that no one else knows their language and that these things have been changed. But in the narrative, like if we're just thinking about what the narrative is claiming about itself, taking the text at face value, the Book of Mormon is being written and compiled by these guys who are supposedly reading records from 1,000 years earlier or even longer than that. And that introduces a whole new problem. It's like in Joseph Smith trying to pre-apologize for these other problems that he's aware of, he creates a whole host of other issues, which is how are Mormon and Moroni, if what is written here is true, which is that the Hebrew hath been altered by us also and none other people knoweth our language, how are Mormon and Moroni reading records that are written 1,000 years earlier by Nephi and Lehi, if that is true?
The seer stone? Like, that's the only thing that makes sense, right? Is they're just, I don't know.
It's done by, well, it does say it was translated by Revelation, does it? At the beginning
It does,
of that?
yes.
Yeah.
And it tells you if you don't believe it, you better watch out. Yeah. So the big reason we're looking at this in so much depth is because these are claims in the Book of Mormon about how the Book of Mormon came to be. So these claims, at bare minimum, these claims must be literally historically true for the Book of Mormon to exist the way that we have it today, right? Because these are claims that the Book of Mormon is making about itself and the reason it was written. And the real clear implication of these verses, or one of the real clear implication of these verses, is that Hebrew is a less information dense language than Egyptian is. And I want to reread that portion right here where he says, if our plates had been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew. What that means implicitly that this author is saying is that Egyptian allowed them to record more information than Hebrew would have.
Okay.
Everybody agree?
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah,
what it's
he's saying
saying.
Hebrew, yeah.
Yeah, so what it is saying, if we can just pop up that next slide too, just to really drive this home, it's implying a relationship between these two different languages. It's saying implicitly that Hebrew would require more space to express the same content, and that Reformed Egyptian allows more content per unit of space. Yeah. So what this means is that the Book of Mormon is saying that Reformed Egyptian is more information dense than Hebrew.
Yeah, if your amount of space is a plate that is being engraved upon, the claim here is that Hebrew would require more of those plates to express the same content than if you were to do it in Reformed Egyptian, which allows more of that content per plate.
Yes.
If you want to pick that as your unit of space, because I feel like that's maybe quite neat, and we know roughly the size that they were meant to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let's talk about the big problem for that, which is none of that is true. So if we pull up the next slide, we'll look at these different Egyptian scripts that I've kind of have already introduced. But the first of these scripts that we'll talk about is hieroglyphic. So hieroglyphic, its use dates back to around 2600 BCE to 400 CE or AD. And as I said, this was a formal monumental type writing. It was found in temples, in tombs. And as far as information density goes, it had lower efficiency for long texts, and it often used multiple signs to convey meaning. And what I mean by that is Egyptian was not always necessarily a logographic language or a pictographic language. So a pictographic is basically going to be a picture that is conveying some type of concept. Logographic is going to be something akin to each character relates to a word, right? That's what a logo is. A logos is a word. And then we have phonetic languages like Hebrew. So Hebrew has an alphabet. They did not, at least at this time, they did not use vowels. And so you can see kind of that relationship between information density. So one of the things about Egyptian and about hieroglyphic in particular that's very interesting is that it was not simply one type of language. So it had some elements of phonetics, like where they would spell things out using characters as an alphabet. And in fact, that's one of the ways that the Rosetta Stone was cracked, is those characters where things were spelled out phonetically. It had logographs, but what it definitely did not have but was a very popular but incorrect belief in Joseph Smith's day, is a character that could relate to basically an entire paragraph worth of text. That just simply isn't something that we see reflected in Egyptian. And for people who are listening and thinking, Colby, you're just a lawyer, what do you know about linguistics? I thought the same exact thing. So John was nice enough to put me in contact with a PhD linguist, and I've talked through my ideas that we're presenting in this episode with them, and they have basically said, yep, you have it exactly right, and in fact gave me some additional ammunition as we're talking about Egyptian and how it worked.
Can I just throw something in there real quick?
Of course.
I think it seems to me that this is an inherently magical or spiritual view to take of this language. I think it implies a certain level of mysticism projected towards the Egyptian language, because I'm struggling to imagine a world in which you don't think it is either a revelatory experience or a spiritual experience or some kind of mystical experience to be able to divine that much information from a single character. I don't know that it's reasonable to think that anyone would look at a character and go, these people memorized an entire paragraph of distinct specific text that relates to a specific character, and that character is only ever written for those exact words at a paragraph's length. I don't think anyone is really believing that in Joseph Smith's time. I think what they're doing is they're looking at this and going, this is a mystical language. This is something that with a mystical worldview or a religious worldview, a divine being or a spirit or something like that will reveal the meaning of it to you through whatever medium that would be.
Yeah, and I think you can understand why people would have that view, right? Mm-hmm. Like today we can read Egyptian. Yeah. But if you were to go back in time to Joseph Smith's time, and you're going over to the catacombs of Egypt and you're looking at this language inscribed on a tomb, and it's such an otherworldly experience, of course you're going to have this like appeal to the arcane, because it wasn't just popular with religious people. Like Egyptian was the famously unknowable language. Mm-hmm. To kind of hit some additional detail on exactly how hieroglyphics itself worked. This is a quote from Champollion based on his work with the language, actually cracking the Rosetta Stone. He said of hieroglyphic, it is a complex system, writing figurative, symbolic, and phonetic all at once in the same text, in the same phrase. I would almost say in the same word. And so it's important to note that Egyptian didn't simply work the way that the author of Mormon 9 is claiming it, where you can pull, like Nemo said, a whole paragraph of text out of a single character. And in fact, when you start thinking about how that would work, it's pretty apparent that it can't work that way, because no language is going to function if you have to memorize an entire paragraph's worth of very specific text for every individual character. So
is it worth noting that in the grammar, in the grammar and Egyptian alphabet that Joseph Smith produces, we're going to talk about that?
I'm looking at you like you are stealing my thunder, John.
Yeah, we will. Okay. We will bring that up, John.
All right. I didn't say anything. Keep going.
Slides.
Keep going. Keep going.
So one of the other reasons that I've pointed to, or we're doing this analysis by looking at hieroglyphic, which again dates back to 3000 BC roughly, is because apologists may claim after this episode comes out, well, Reformed Egyptian is an Egyptian. But one of the reasons that we're looking at hieroglyphic Egyptian first is because languages really only evolve the one direction. They usually go from being pictographic to logographic to then being phonetic, and they never go the other direction. It wouldn't make any sense for us now that we have an alphabet, and so we can really easily use words. to go backwards and to start using pictographic languages. It just wouldn't be practical. Language doesn't evolve that way. So let's look at our two other Egyptian scripts. We've got hieratic, which started being used around 2600 BC to around 600 BCE. And again, this was our first cursive form of hieroglyphics used for everyday writing, like on papyrus or administration. And as far as its information density goes, it was more compact than hieroglyphics, and the form of using this cursive form of Egyptian reduced the visual complexity while preserving similar linguistic content. And so that we do see it being a little more information dense than hieroglyphics, but that's because it's simplifying the characters, basically. The way hieroglyphics worked is you would have characters and then you would have special characters next to them, like they were called determinatives, that would help you understand like the relationship between these different characters. And as this language evolved, we can see it becoming simplified in that hieratic form.
And just for someone who's not super smart, me, when you say a language is more dense, it means it can provide more specificity per character than a previous language. In other words, tell me if I'm...
the other way around.
I think the other way around, but yes.
Wait, so hieroglyphics, the first one, I would just assume those characters there are more broad, more general, and less specific in terms of what is conveyed in meaning by each symbol than the hieratic, than the demotic.
When I say information density, what I mean is we're looking at one character, how much information is going to be conveyed by that one character. And so hieratic does get simpler in some ways because it becomes more compact, but I wouldn't say that it packs more information per character. It's more like we're simplifying the characters. You can see kind of the difference. Like if we pull up that hieroglyphic slide and then look at the hieratic slide, you can see the difference in the formality of the writing systems, right?
It's easier to write. Detail. It's easier to write hieratic.
Correct.
The symbols for hieratic than it is the symbols for hieroglyphic.
And I think a good
is
modern,
that right?
Correct.
A good modern example that might help people is if you look at something like Mandarin Chinese, that has a traditional and a simplified version. So the characters are either more complex or more simple, depending on where you're from speaking it. But to the point, you'll have a character that represents the word tree, right? And so that in one character, in one unit of space, is the word tree. In English, that's 4 letters, T-R-E-E. Each of those 4 letters is one of our characters, and that's less information dense because each one of those is just a unit of phonetic sound that we put together to create the word. Whereas in Chinese, it's just one symbol that signifies that word.
Got it. Thank you.
Right. And then demotic basically gets further streamlined and becomes more efficient. So this begins being used around the time that the Book of Mormon begins, so in 650 BCE, and was used until about 450 CE or AD. It's a highly abstract language, a streamlined script used for legal, commercial, and daily documents. And you can see it becomes the most efficient pre-alphabetic Egyptian script, maximizes the speed and compression for practical writing. So you can see the big difference, like Nemo talked about. The characters become less formal, they become easier to write. And instead of using like one character with then multiple determinatives or special characters that are off to the side that are helping explain. So using Nemo's example of like tree, we may have had a character that said tree and then determinatives that were added to say like what color of tree it was or what species of tree it was. This is just a hypothetical example, obviously.
You do still get this in languages like Korean and Chinese where you have compound characters, where you have additional determinatives that determine the relationship of that thing, because it's not just tree, it's big tree or it's far tree or it's near tree or whatever.
Right. Yeah. One of the examples I was looking at when I was looking at the hieroglyphics is you would have like a character for man, for example, and then you would have a determinative that was basically added or adjacent to that character. So it's a separate character, but it's another character that's helping clarify the meaning of that first character. And what it was often adding is like what profession that man worked in, or like whether he was married or whether he was single, even like what sequence in birth order he came in his family. So they had like these determinatives that were adding this traditional meaning. And the way I'm seeing it is the hieratic and demotic is basically combining those multiple characters into like a new character, but not necessarily always just one new character. It's just simplifying the script to convey the same meaning. So I would say it's becoming more compact over time, getting closer to phonetics, which is where the language evolved later. Any other thoughts on that?
One of my thoughts was that here you talk about how some of these are used for daily use. And I think Lundwall's argument is that the text, people didn't keep histories. They didn't write them down like that. So I don't think people were keeping journal entries saying like I Ammon or I Nephi being like, I don't think that was
Today
what
I
was
went to
the
the
daily.
store.
Right. I don't think that was what you mean by daily. Maybe because that's what I think of daily writing.
No, what I mean is some of the earliest texts that we have are the things just relating to basic administration, basic legal questions. You can find contracts. I remember once when I was looking at early Egyptian documents, I found like a complaint that someone was lodging about a set of iron ingots that they had bought from some trader. And so that's what I mean by daily use, is not necessarily journaling or keeping histories like Dr. Lundwall was talking about. I'm talking about like daily, everyday use that people would use writing for. And again, I guess it's important to remember most people in that day and age were not literate. So the people who are using daily writing is going to be more formal. It's going to be basically lawyers like me are going to be the people who are doing the writing in the way that they kind of conduct business.
That's another thing about the Book of Mormon, because I think it does make that's not what we're discussing today, I don't think, is they're making the claim that all these people were literate. And because I think they say, write down Mosiah's speech and then send it out to all the people. So these are people that are very advanced in this language area. Yet we have zero trace of this.
Yeah, I'm sure Benjamin and Mosiah are like, everyone study the scriptures. You need to study your scriptures every day.
That's a really
it
good
just
point.
assumes
Well,
all of the Nephites and Lamanites
Right.
are
Even
literate.
Jesus says directly, search the words of Isaiah because they're so valuable, which begs the question or prompts the question, how exactly are they searching the records of Isaiah?
I mean, at this point, probably Google.
Wait, is that
they're
Book of
just that
Mormon?
advanced.
Is that Book of Mormon Jesus?
That's
or-
Book of
Yeah,
Mormon
Book of Mormon Jesus.
Oh, okay,
That's why I'm confused. We must have at least, then like, you have all the Nephites that are studying the scriptures, studying
Yeah.
Isaiah.
Wait, so New Testament Jesus isn't saying study the scriptures.
But then
Is
if
it-
they're studying the scriptures,
I don't think so.
We have this situation where we're not in a place which we would be in this sort of time where you have a copy of scripture maybe that is read by a priest and everyone hears it orally. People apparently have got their own copies of ancient scripture.
they have triple combinations.
So
they're quads.
So, like you made that glib remark about having a printing press, John. They must have done in order for people to have their own copies of the scriptures to go search.
It is very odd how much the way that the Book of Mormon peoples engage with writing and with orality and literality is basically exactly what we would expect
That's
from
the
someone.
next. You know how we had that meme? We've had different memes, and we had the plates that couldn't be lifted because they were so heavy meme, and we had the other meme that we did.
The Egyptian, or I'm sorry, the Isaiah.
Yeah.
Isaiah playing Sonic the Hedgehog riding on a bittern.
we need the meme of like ancient Nephites and Lamanites carrying their triple combinations of their quads around with them to study the words of Isaiah.
Yeah, because we had this whole thing in England, to drop being English for a second, we had this whole thing where people wanted the Bible in their own language. For a long time it was in Latin, and they had to just rely on being told what it said. And there was this whole movement. There were martyrs that died for the language of the scriptures being the common tongue of the people, that people could then access it. And then you had the invention of the printing press and all those sorts of things. The
and
Book
then
of
people
Mormon
had to
just,
learn to read.
yeah, the Book of Mormon discards all that and just goes, no. We don't have like a common Bible that people read from. We don't have people that stand between people and God. It's this very democratized vision of the religious landscape that just didn't exist in those times because it couldn't be democratized because people didn't have their own scriptures and they often couldn't read them even if they were in their language.
Right. And not only did it not exist in that time period, what time period does it reflect? It literally reflects
Right,
Joseph Smith's
time period.
worldview, where the American Bible Society, I believe it was trying to get a Bible in every home, where children were taught to read using the King James Bible.
Including Joseph Smith himself.
Including Joseph Smith himself. I really don't think that context of really putting Joseph Smith in his time and place, like in the burned over district during the Second Great Awakening in New York, the way I view it is like that itself, that context is almost a character in the Book of Mormon's creation and the creation of Mormonism all by itself. That when you understand, Joseph Smith wasn't even the first restorationist in that area. Like there were other people, including the Campbellites, who believed that Christianity had been lost, that we needed to recapture this lost form of primitive Christianity. And I guess it is just so telling, when we look at the way Joseph Smith thought that worked, it reflects his worldview, not the worldview of the time period that he or these authors, these purported ancient authors were actually writing about.
I feel Moroni disappearing.
I know he got Thanos.
Is it Mormon?
But because also then why is it this great challenge for him to abridge these records and go through all this effort to abridge them and engrave them on plates to preserve them? There were dozens of copies kicking around easily. These scriptures were everywhere. So the Book of Mormon,
could they survive 1,000 years?
But the Book of Mormon at the same time talks about how people should go and study the scriptures and go and study those words, but also talks about how these records are kept and preserved and passed down. So it's like they're democratized, but also they're very specific and held and need to be. They talk about people having caretakers, like these scriptures being passed down from father to son to be looked after and to be moved forward. Why is that happening if they're also just amongst the people and the people can study them themselves?
I guess the way I had viewed it as an active member is that like you have the plates that you keep track of and you protect and whatever. But then you have like maybe scrolls that everyone's got. Maybe instead of a quad, it's like you got a whole stack of.
But then scrolls have to be handwritten. That's so much effort.
Yeah, I don't.
God in His wisdom saw that there would need to be plates someday.
Yeah, but in the meantime, everyone's got their own scrolls
in a stone box.
Yeah,
so that they could be preserved for 1,000 years, so that Joseph could get them. God, checkmate.
These agricultural...
It sounds like you two are in favor of hellfire. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, these agricultural Native Americans have got enough time because they are using agriculture and whatnot. They've got enough time to sit down and write all this stuff.
I do think it may be, for a future LDS Discussions episode, maybe good to look. And actually, I talked about this 4 years ago, the last time I was in the studio with you, John. I talked about how when you look at the Book of Mormon's values, to your point, Julia, about democratization, there's so many values that are spoken of in the Book of Mormon that make absolute perfect sense from that early American worldview that Joseph Smith had, and make absolutely no sense from an ancient, pre-Christian Hebrew
like infant baptism.
Well, infant baptism is one, but even just the idea of like democracy in the first place is something that like we would not. I mean, yes, it dates back, to ancient times in theory, and dates back to like Greek and Rome, but it isn't something that the Hebrews experimented with yet. According to the Book of Mormon, they see the wisdom in something that looks very akin to early American, government systems. It's very telling to me.
Getting rid of kings and saying no more of those, and yeah.
Yes.
Not that I feel that personally or anything. Let's move on.
Well, let's look at the Rosetta Stone, because when I did have a chance to speak to that linguist, they pointed me to the Rosetta Stone being a great way to understand the information density of Hebrew relative to Egyptian. So for people who aren't familiar, the Rosetta Stone was found in Egypt, and I believe, Nemo, still probably exists over in the British Museum.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
We're looking after it. It's at the Louvre, right?
Is it at the Louvre?
Is it at the Louvre? I thought it was at the British Museum.
British Museum. You're right.
I think your point is that you can see it without your spiritual eyes. Is that what you're
You can see it without your spiritual eyes.
Yeah, you don't even have to pay to see it, because we're just lovely. We let people see other people's stuff for free. For no cost.
So one of the things about the Rosetta Stone that's so interesting, and the way they were able to crack the code, is that the Rosetta Stone has a phrase, a decree, written in 3 different languages on it. So it's written in hieroglyphic, then it's written in Demotic, then it's written in Greek. And the reason is because of kind of the confluence of King Ptolemy. And so if we can pull up the slides, I've got a picture of the Rosetta Stone for people who may not be familiar with it. I've got a selection of the characters that basically shows kind of how it works. So this, I believe, comes from actually Champollion's notebooks. And you can see he's trying to line up the hieroglyphics with the Demotic and then with the Greek below it. Now, one of the phrases that's written on the Rosetta Stone is this phrase here. Nemo, would you mind reading that for us?
The priests of Egypt declare that King Ptolemy V is a benefactor. He has supported the temples, reduced taxes, and maintained order. Therefore, he should be honored with statues and worship. This decree shall be written in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek.
And so that's one of the ways that they were able to find out the relationship between these languages and basically reverse engineer a translation, is because we did understand Greek. And so we worked from that to then specifically with the names, and we'll get there in just a minute, to break the code.
It sounds a little bit facetious, but I think it is really worth saying. This is an example of an ancient text talking about what language it has been written in and living up to that claim. That can happen. It has happened. The Rosetta Stone made a very accurate claim about itself, that it was written in 3 languages, and it was written in those 3 languages.
Yes, and to link with Dr. Lundwall's episode, one of the things you can see is look at the way this is written. It's a decree written about the king, about a place, and then it tells you just the very basic formulaic stuff that you need to know. And that's the way that people wrote in those days.
You could argue it's almost superfluous to say this decree shall be written in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. That's a flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And even then it's very tight. There's no... and yet, even verily, I say, it shall be written in even hieroglyphic and demotic, and also the language of our forefathers, which is Greek. Right? No, it's just bam, bam, bam. This is written in this, this, and this.
Right, because we had just read, don't judge me for my father's mistakes or my mistakes or the mistakes.
Nobody's got time to be carving that into stone. No one's got time for
instead, no, you're absolutely right. When you're having to write using like physical elements, where you have to etch something into plates or you're having to chisel something into stone, you are pretty practical with how you use language, how you use that space. And yet the Book of Mormon is full of so many just endless space fillers and asides that make total sense when you look at the Book of Mormon as a dictated text, an orally dictated text, but make very little sense when you picture Mormon and Moroni abridging these records. Like, there's so many times when the Book of Mormon uses phrases like, it'll say a phrase and it'll say, which is to say, or in other words. That makes absolutely no sense when you're doing abridging.
And it's worth pointing out that we've done an episode on this as part of the LDS Discussions series, the sort of fingerprints of it being an orally dictated text, and that is definitely worth checking out.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know you're building towards this point, but I'm just going to say it right now. This slide alone really proves the point about plates and characters and density. Because if we look at how many Egyptian characters, I don't care if it's Reformed Egyptian or traditional Egyptian, if you just look at how many Egyptian characters are needed to produce that number of English words, and then you try and multiply that out, there's no way that plates that could exist in our realm of physics with the dimensions, of the plates as described, not even counting the sealed portion. There's no way that the number of words produced in the Book of Mormon that we have could have fit on the gold plates.
Right.
And I know we're building to that point, but right now that slide is kind of already proving this point to me.
That is the most information dense of all the languages on that stone, and it's still not enough to get you what you'd need for the Book of Mormon. And also, just a quick point to what we said, the fact that Mormon and Moroni were abridging this record, we tend to gloss over that word abridge, but they were editing. They were trying to bring together all these things. In doing so, you think they would have absolutely cleared up the filler phrases, even if those filler phrases were there because it was written on scrolls and it was easy to just and and whatever. Once you're tightening it up, once you're abridging, once you're bringing together and putting into a physical form, you're going to be practical and efficient with it. And they just weren't.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this, this is a slight aside, but there's this scripture in the book of Alma. One of the other areas I've been looking at that's interesting is how little the Book of Mormon talks about disease. And I don't know, as someone who experienced, the COVID pandemic, and we kind of saw the way that diseases can shut down the entire world, I started thinking about how we have certain diseases that are present in our population that are called zoonotic diseases. COVID was one of those diseases, right? It's something that lives in reservoirs of animals. And then because we have contact with those animals, just as a consequence of having domesticated animals and animals that live close to us, we experience different diseases that are present in those animals and that make this species cross. And COVID was one of those. And one of the things that's interesting is the Book of Mormon seems to have no recognition of this at all. There's like one phrase where the Book of Mormon talks about fevers or people. It does use like sicknesses kind of in a spiritual sense, but there's actually only one phrase when it's talking about people experiencing fevers. And the thing that's really odd, to your point, Nemo, is the scriptures, and again, this is part of the abridged portion because it's in the book of Alma, it's talking about how, some people get fevers, but not very many people get fevers. And it's just a very weird, it's a very weird phrase that makes total sense when we're looking at the Book of Mormon as an orally dictated text, because if I'm orally dictating something or I'm orally speaking, a lot of times I'll change my mind or I'll add additional clarity. But it makes no sense looking at the literality of having to engrave these phrases on metal plates and condensing down records that were originally written on scrolls or however else they were kept onto those metal plates. It just doesn't reflect that at all. So yeah, like you said, John, we're building to this idea that the Book of Mormon's claims about Reformed Egyptian and this information density really don't bear out. If we can go to the next slide, I think, I am always appreciative, John, when you say we could have ended these slides several slides ago, because that's the way I approach stuff as an attorney, is I like to win multiple ways if I can. So let's keep going, because I think it gets worse, not better, for the Book of Mormon's claims. On this slide, I've pulled an extract from a real story that was written in Egyptian hieroglyphics from around 1200 BC called The Tale of Two Brothers. And it basically tells the mythological story of Osiris and Anubis and the origins of Anubis as being guardian of the underworld in Egyptian mythology. And on the right hand...
somewhere I've heard those names before.
Yeah. And on the right-hand slide, I've got a translation of the first couple of verses of Genesis 1. In the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth. And I've got those laid next to each other just so that people can start to see the information density of Egyptian relative to Hebrew. You can see that for the word his, for example, in Egyptian, that first character, you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 characters that come together to make that word his. Whereas
that's wild.
It is wild, because you've got those determinatives that are helping adding that additional clarifying meaning. Then when you look at, Hebrew, obviously Hebrew is a phonetic script, so it's being written as an alphabet. And you can see that they're not exactly equivalent, but are you guys seeing any appreciable space saving between the two? I get that these aren't exactly the same phrase, but are you seeing kind of what the Book of Mormon tells us, which is Egyptian should be able to encode much more language or much more information per character than Hebrew? Are you seeing that at all on this slide? No.
And that's even with Hebrew doing things like dropping vowels and adding dots to show the vowels ought to be there and things like that.
Right.
It's just not there.
And to give a direct comparison, if we go to the next slide, I actually did take a phrase from this extract of A Tale of Two Brothers. So he made sharp his dagger. He placed it in his hand. When we translate that into Hebrew, you can see that this second sentence of this story takes 41 Egyptian characters. It takes 39 English letters or characters to convey the same information. And it gives us, and that is then translated into 33 Hebrew characters. So ironically, what we're actually seeing is the exact opposite of what the Book of Mormon says. It takes 33 characters. And again, as you said, Nemo, Hebrew doesn't use vowels in this time period. So we're using 33 Hebrew characters to convey the same meaning as 41 Egyptian characters. There are actually more Egyptian characters than Hebrew characters.
In other words, if Joseph wanted to be more efficient, or if the Nephites and Lamanites wanted to be more efficient, they would have written in Hebrew, not Egyptian.
Correct.
Is that right?
Based on how Egyptian
Exactly.
actually works, in that multiple characters are needed to make one word at times, rather than what Joseph Smith believed about Egyptian, which was that one character can contain multiple words.
Sentences, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we can go forward a few slides to the one with the notebook on it. This is actually from Champollion's notebook. This helps explain how they cracked the code beginning in 1822 as Champollion was working on this over in France. You can see that the way they were able to crack the code is because there are certain words in Hebrew that are spelled phonetically, including names. So the name that we talked about from that inscription earlier, King Ptolemy, you can see that grouping of characters in the upper right hand of your screen spelled out in Egyptian the name Ptolemy. So all of those characters, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 characters that I'm counting, plus the cartouche, which is the circle around it that basically recognizes it as something that should be spelled out phonetically. We've got 8 characters to then go to spell out the name Ptolemy. And again, this helps just make this point of Egyptian is not going to save you any space, especially when you're dealing with names, which is something that the Book of Mormon has quite a lot of.
Many names. And in fact, what's ironic about that is the church will often push forward as a claim about the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, just how many unique names there are, how many unique nouns the Book of Mormon contains. But that creates a massive issue for its information density.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because when we're especially when we're dealing with names and nouns that aren't originally Egyptian, which is literally everything that's in the Book of Mormon, that's when you lose any information density of Egyptian in the first place. So even if there is a slight advantage information density in writing some things in Egyptian, it's the things that Egyptians have been writing for a long time, not what the Book of Mormon records, which is things that are actually Hebrew thought patterns, Hebrew words, Hebrew names, but then are being translated over into Egyptian.
It's just made me think about some of the loan shifting arguments that people like Dan Peterson make about things like horses in the Book of Mormon. And it's this idea that, okay, well, they didn't have a word for it, so they used a word they already had. And I wonder now whether they might try and add to that and say, well, oh yes, because he's using a form of Egyptian, therefore to use a more familiar word would save space rather than having to spell out what a tapir is or anything like that. I wonder whether this might give them ammunition to do that. But even if it did, it doesn't work for the information density of Egyptian anyway.
Right.
Because even if you make that little space saving there, you can't do that for everything. You can't do that for unique names. And the word his is quite important, appears a lot in the Book of Mormon. It takes 4 characters to write. So.
Wait, hang on. Let me see if I understand. So you're saying names kind of have to be long. Is that kind of right?
Yeah.
Names, because they're often spelled phonetically, are going to be longer.
But then I'm thinking of like the Book of Ether or Mormon, whatever he's saying, this man with all of his 10,000 are being killed. But he's saying the names of these people, right? Like, I feel like that would take up so much space.
Do they do that? Don't they do that genealogy thing in the Book of Mormon where so-and-so begot so-and-so, begot so-and-so, begot so-and-so?
Yeah. Think of how many in the little books between Jacob and Words of Mormon, you've got some of those little books like Jared, Omni.
Yeah.
You've got guys who entered the narrative and basically say, and here's my name, and my dad's name was this, and now I'm going to give the plates to my brother or to my son whose name is this. That would take up an incredible amount of space for absolutely no substantive effect, right? It doesn't do anything to move the narrative forward. But what it also links to, and again, this comes back to kind of the framing we use to respond to certain apologists that are trying to make the Book of Mormon a looser translation, that very clearly is the Book of Mormon treating itself as a tight, literal translation of this guy wrote these words on this piece of metal, and that's why it's so important, and that's why it was translated and kept for our day.
I was going to say, in one of our past episodes, we talked about how there was a couple of witnesses laid in secondhand, but they said that the plates were either 7 plates big or 14, which, like, if you just put down the names in the way that you've just shown, that's going to take up, your space is gone, I would feel like. Like, you don't have a lot of wiggle room.
Again,
with that.
we've looked at information density in the past, and we've looked at similar examples of metal plates, and it was determined, I think, that 10,000 words a plate are missing.
Yeah.
Right. In any sort of language that we know of that has been written into plates, and the amount of information that's then contained on those plates, you're missing an entire university dissertation's worth of text per plate, which is in order to get the amount of information that you need for the Book of Mormon.
That's wild.
We can go back and check that episode that we did on that, but yeah.
Or Mormon and Moroni and Joseph Smith were really strong.
Yeah.
Really
Joseph Smith
strong.
with his limp and his... Yeah.
I mean, we know they were because of how heavy those plates would have been, right?
I felt a bit bad.
Or the paper was really thin.
So
Arnold Freiberg got something right, John.
I went to the Church History Museum last week while I was here, and I went there, and they've got this set of plates that weigh about what the witnesses described them to weigh, and they're in a box and are on a little rack, so you can try and lift them up. So you've got guys coming over and doing a little bit of deadlift or whatever. And I tried to hold my tongue, but I went to the senior missionary who was sat there, and I lifted them up, and I went, oof. And Joseph Smith ran with these for 3 miles. And she went, well, he was a strong farm boy.
While fighting people off.
I was like, well, fighting people off? She's like, yeah. I was like, and with a limp? She was like, yeah. I was like, okay, cool. I left it because I was like, well, I'm not, what can you do there? But yeah, it really shows that if these needed to be heavier than they were described by the witnesses, if the witnesses were lifting them with their spiritual arms as well as seeing them with their spiritual eyes, then yeah, that's maybe an explanation.
Their spiritual arms were jacked.
Absolutely jacked.
Yeah.
Just some jacked spiritual arms.
I mean, we've seen their physical arms in Arnold Freiberg's depictions. Imagine how strong.
Yeah.
That's who was inspired, was Arnold Freiberg.
Arnold Freiberg had a thing for delts and biceps.
Even the women are kind of ripped. And the baptism, that painting.
Definitely. So let's keep talking about the Rosetta Stone really quickly. If we can go to, I think, the second slide, Nemo, with the notebook on it.
The number of lines total.
Yes.
And by the way, for those who are interested, this is what an actual translation of ancient text looks like written in a notebook. We'll get to another version of what it looks like later, but this is what a pro looks like.
This is from someone who actually cracked the code. Yes, exactly. I did pull this from Champollion's notebook himself. So the total number of hieroglyphic lines on the Rosetta Stone is 14 lines. Over those 14 lines, we have about 1,200 to 1,400 individual signs. You may be asking, why is it difficult to calculate the number of additional signs? That's because the way that Egyptian works with these determinatives and with these other characters that are added to clarify the meaning of an original character, it's not as simple as the way we would count the number of letters. It's almost like if anyone took Spanish in high school and you've got an enye, right? Mm-hmm. Does that count as two characters or does it count as one?
Well, in German, you've got the S set, which is one character represent two letter S's.
Yes.
Which is it one or two? Similarly, like I was talking about earlier with compound characters in things like Korean, again, is that one character or two because they've been brought together, but they are two separate characters. So
exactly. Yeah. Then when we get to the demotic lines, we've got 32 lines of demotic that comprises 4,000 to 5,000 sign or stroke equivalents. And again, because it was a cursive form, it's a little difficult to break down exactly where you demarcate those lines, but that's basically why we have to give a range. Then in Greek, the lines in Greek that are written on the Rosetta Stone, we have 54 lines in Greek. And again, this is going to take up the most amount of space because it's an alphabetic language. And so we've got 7,000 to 8,000 letters. Now, what I did from here was I kind of theorized, what would it take if we imagined that on the Rosetta Stone, we had hieroglyphics at the top, then we had the demotic, then we had the Greek, and then at the bottom, we add a fourth language of Hebrew from that time period. That's where this next slide, or this table then comes from, is trying to imagine that. So what this helps show is both what type of writing system we're talking about, right? Greek is alphabetic, hieroglyphic is mixed. It can have some phonetics, plus it can have some logographs and some things that work alphabetically. Then with demotic, we've got cursive logograph hybrids because it's building from that Egyptian base of hieroglyphics. Then with Hebrew, we've got consonantal alphabetic. So an alphabetic system that doesn't use any vowels. And so if we were to envision writing that phrase that we read earlier, or I think just
you've put it at the bottom of the slide.
Phrase.
You've put Ptolemy, beloved of Ptah, has reduced taxes for the people. That's the phrase we're working from.
Yes, that is the phrase. Yeah. So trying to envision what would that phrase look like if it were spelled or written in these different languages. We've got the Greek would take 30 to 40 letters to write that. The hieroglyphic would take 25 to 40 signs. Right there, you can see a huge problem, right? Which is, even though the Egyptian was written in fewer lines, we're seeing the same amount of signs to communicate roughly the same amount of information as the Greek alphabet. The demotic,
it's got names in it.
Because it's got names in it, right? Yeah. The demotic, you've got 15 to 25 clusters. And again, the clusters are a little bit more complicated because it's a cursive form of kind of bringing together what was already in the hieroglyphic. Then with Hebrew, and again, we're only dealing with the consonants, you've got 22 different letters. So what strikes you about kind of looking at it this way?
Hebrew is one of the most information dense. Mm-hmm. And they're complaining that they couldn't have used Hebrew because it would have taken up too much space. Well, actually, it's almost half of what the sort of hieroglyphic or the Greek took up at the higher end of their ranges.
Though. The demotic is pretty...
The demotic
would have been a good use.
But it's also written in clusters. So if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see a rudimentary kind of translation of this. Ptolemy, beloved of Ptah, has reduced taxes for the people. So you can see here, we've got it in Greek. We've got it in the hieroglyphics here on the top right. And then in Demotic, one of the reasons that it is a little bit more complicated for Demotic, Demotic, is because it is written in these clusters. So it's difficult to break down exactly where you draw the line between one and the next.
Where's Demotic? At bottom right?
Demotic is bottom right, yes. Yeah. And then Hebrew is bottom left. So you can see the 22 letters in biblical Hebrew. So I did make sure and use the Hebrew from the time period that we're talking about.
And top right is Egyptian, right?
And the top right is Egyptian hieroglyphics. And then below that is the Egyptian Demotic. Yeah. So what you can see is, you can see like maybe some space saving as far as the Egyptian hieroglyphics are more like pictures, so they're harder characters to establish, but we're really not saving any space when we're talking about just character number.
And something I want to make clear to the audience, because I'm not sure we have really pressed on it, is that the reason we're talking about both Demotic and hieroglyphic is because there's some wiggle room for an apologist to say Reformed Egyptian. Well, you're assuming he's talking about hieroglyphs. He might have been talking about a form of Demotic or something like that. Doesn't matter which one we look at.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They have the same problem.
So my summary from looking at this slide is that it doesn't matter which language you're ever going to be talking about. They're all within the same sort of order of magnitude of taking up space. There's no magical language that's going to take you to extra orders of magnitude of efficiency. They're all going to be, within one standard deviation of space from each other at best.
Yeah. And ironically, the other takeaway I have, particularly from that slide, is Egyptian takes up more room, not less room. If anything, yes, I agree with you. They basically are equivalent, roughly equivalent, I would say. There's no significant space savings one way or the other. But if there are significant space savings in favor of Hebrew, not the opposite way as the Book of Mormon claims.
And then if they were to argue that the Egyptian was reformed, we've already kind of alluded to the point that languages don't go that direction.
Exactly.
They don't get more information dense, they get less information dense.
Exactly. They allow you to John's question earlier about this, they allow you to convey greater levels of specificity. When we get to an alphabetic language, we're able to convey more specificity because we're compacting less information in each individual character.
I was going to say, like, if Nephi, if he's reading Isaiah and things like that, he must understand Hebrew to some degree. Why is the Book of Mormon written in Reformed Egyptian?
Because they claim that it saves space. That's what they say.
That's the only,
yeah.
But could it be
they said if we could have had the space to write it in Hebrew, then we would.
And it would have been perfect.
And it would have
been
been
also,
perfect.
we've changed the Hebrew.
Well, I guess let me change my question. Why did Joseph Smith claim that they were writing? Right. Because
he needed a language that people couldn't understand, so he could claim to be one that could translate it.
Hebrew,
but
and
see,
they would understand.
That's why he's saying no Hebrew. He's saying Reformed Egyptian because that's something he gets to play with, and no one gets to claim he's wrong about.
Julia, aren't you noting the fact that in America in 1827 or 8, nobody knew that the Rosetta Stone had been interpreted.
Right.
So Joseph didn't know that no one could read Egyptian, that someone could read Egyptian.
Joseph knew no one could read Egyptian.
Right.
It was the famously unknowable language.
That's why he picked it.
But it just makes the most sense to me for Nephi and Lehi to be writing in Hebrew or a Reformed Hebrew like he's claiming. Reformed Egyptian, it doesn't make sense for me to.
But then, like I said, so Reformed Hebrew is too close to a language that people can understand in his time period, so he knows he can get fact-checked. Whereas if he picks Egyptian, the famously unknowable language, not knowing the Rosetta Stone's on its way, that's why he would pick that. And he gets the Egyptian connection from their wandering on the Arabian Peninsula and their kind of being in that sort of area.
To me, it just feels so obvious that that's like, because you said he's picked a language that is unfalsifiable. Like, it just reminds me of the story, I don't mean to get sidetracked, but it reminds me of the story of the lost 116 pages, where Nephi's like, oh my gosh, God told me to write this down, and this is the reason why, because 2,000 years later, or however long later, Joseph's going to lose these pages. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's such a faith-building story. But it's like, no, it's different because Joseph didn't, I don't know, like, it just seems silly that to think that this is the case, or Reformed Egyptian. Oh yeah, Reformed Egyptian. Nobody knows this language, but like,
because the other out with the 116 pages is he just reproduces them perfectly again.
Right.
If he's having it revealed directly to him by God, he should just be able to do them again. If he can't, the question is why can't he? Right. Because he should be able to. That shouldn't be an issue of, oh well, people will take them and say, well, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that.
I mean, it just makes much more sense that God would have not let Joseph give the 116 pages to Martin.
Right.
Yeah.
right? Doesn't that make the most sense?
Oh no, but God doesn't interfere with agency unless it's to get Joseph to practice polygamy. Then he does interfere with agency quite heavily.
Yeah, he certainly interfered with Laban's, agency and had Joseph chopped his head off. Like, God interferes in the scriptures with people's agency all the time.
Yeah.
Doesn't he?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. I think, your question, Julia, is a great one because I think what it reveals to me is just where you start to really look at the Book of Mormon seams, like where the narrative fits together, it just really doesn't make any sense. And that sounds so pejorative, but I don't mean it that way. I mean, when we view it from literal historicity, when we're just looking at the question of historicity, it is really difficult to understand why, to your point, why Nephi and Lehi would be writing in Egyptian when, according to the book itself, Hebrew would allow them to keep a perfect record. It just doesn't really make any sense unless you view it as Joseph Smith needs some other language for the record to be written in because people can't, to Nemo's point, people can read and write Hebrew in Joseph Smith's day, and he knows that.
Because he took tutors in Kirtland. He had a Hebrew tutor in Kirtland.
Josiah Satius in 1835. And so we know that Joseph Smith knew that people could read and write Hebrew, but we know that no one in the Americas at that time suspected that we'd be able to figure out Egyptian. One of the great ironies, because we're going to now talk about if Mormon and Moroni's claims about information density about Hebrew and Egyptian are false, where then is the author of Mormon 9 kind of getting this idea? Does it match with Joseph Smith's idea? And so we are going to now, to your question, John, look at some of the materials from Kirtland, from the Kirtland Egyptian papers, because what we'll find as we look at this is not only are these claims false about the way that these languages worked, like we just established, but this misunderstanding that the author of Mormon 9 has about the information density of Egyptian relative to Hebrew, what do you know, just happens to be the exact same misunderstanding of Egyptian that we see demonstrated in Joseph Smith's work with Egyptian during the translation of the Book of Abraham and with the Kirtland Egyptian papers. Before we go, though, I just wanted to give one more kind of conclusion for this first part of our slides. Nemo, can we pull that up? Mm-hmm. So this is again from those verses in Mormon 9 that we read. And now behold, we have written this record according to our knowledge in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. And if our plates had been sufficiently large, we would have written in Hebrew, but the Hebrew hath been altered by us also. And if we could have written in Hebrew, behold, you would have had no imperspection in our record. So here's the conclusion, I think, to this first part. Do you have thoughts on that?
I have a thought on that.
He needed to blame the language he needed as many reasons to write off criticisms as he could muster.
Yeah. Absolutely. There are like 3 outs in that passage alone.
We go back to the great Isaiah scrolls, right, that were written in Hebrew. And we've got Joseph Smith then taking a text from Hebrew, throwing it through Reformed Egyptian back into the King James version of that original Hebrew, when he could have actually taken that original Hebrew, which is more information dense, and that's how it could have been written down. So you've got the problem with the time frames that we looked at from the Great Isaiah Scrolls, where the Book of Mormon doesn't reflect the earliest versions of the Hebrew.
Right.
So it's like there's a weird disconnect there in the language that's used, because actually we had that information already in Hebrew, which is more information dense than what Joseph Smith claimed he was using, or what the Book of Mormon claims about itself to have been using. So you have a more information dense version that's found on the Great Isaiah Scrolls. So that was preserved that was preserved over the years, that we have that information. So it's even more ridiculous that then the Book of Mormon claims that through this other language, it was better preserved than what we actually had, because it wasn't better preserved. And they said, could we have written it in Hebrew? It would have been better. Well, we've actually seen that played out, that when it was preserved in Hebrew in the Great Isaiah Scrolls, we had a more correct version than what the King James version that Joseph Smith got through Reformed Egyptian was. If that makes sense. Are you following there?
Yeah. And I think my big question after we look at that is those claims, as we just established, of the information density of Hebrew relative to Egyptian are just simply not true. Mm-hmm. If anything, Hebrew is more information dense than Egyptian. So the question is, why does the Book of Mormon exist at all? frankly, because it says why it was written, it says how it was written, and those claims don't match up with reality. So then it gets us to the second phase of saying, okay, if those claims are not true, if the claims the Book of Mormon makes about the way it was written are not true, where then did it come from? And I think that's when it gets really interesting, because now we look at Joseph Smith's relationship to these languages based on his other work.
And before we jump there, I'm not convinced that we've totally cracked the code on Joseph's thinking. And this is getting back to Julie, what you were about to ask. So I think y'all could fill in the blank. Joseph's sitting there thinking, okay, what language do I need, Book of Mormon characters to have written in? I can't do Hebrew because, fill in the blank.
I can't do Hebrew because people can read and write Hebrew today.
And people will be able to say, well, show me the plates. All the characters on the plates are Hebrew.
Yes.
Okay, is there a match? There's not. Joseph doesn't know Hebrew. So we all can agree why Joseph didn't have Book of Mormon characters writing in Hebrew, right? So we've all agreed then that Joseph switches to Egyptian because in his mind, no one can read Egyptian, correct?
Well, that, and there's also a very clear link between, because the Book of Mormon people start in Jerusalem. There's also a very clear link in the Bible itself, which we know Joseph Smith was very conversant
in. The Old Testament.
Yeah, in the Old Testament,
Joseph and
between
Abraham.
the Hebrews and Egypt, right?
Yeah. So
we have, so we have the link with Moses and the Hebrews when they're in Egypt, and then we have Joseph, who was sold into Egypt. And what do you know?
Joseph Smith claims to be a descendant of.
Yes,
right.
And
when he adds
Joseph
himself
Smith,
into Genesis.
I think one of the things that a lot of people don't know is a lot of people know the story of the Book of Abraham, but one of the scrolls that Joseph Smith found with the Book of Abraham documents that he purchased from Michael Chandler is he said one of the scrolls was a scroll from Joseph out of Egypt. So I guess the way I look at it, John, is we know that probably because of the Old Testament link between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, that Joseph Smith already saw a plausible link between Hebrew and Egyptian. So I don't necessarily think it was just purely Joseph Smith saying, oh, this is the famously unfalsifiable language. It's also believable to his audience because it was believable to him.
Okay, so I think that's part of the puzzle. We know that Joseph picked Egyptian as the written language for Nephites because A, it was unfalsifiable, and B, there are associations in the Old Testament between Israelites and Egypt. What I don't know that we've totally answered is why did Joseph go, but I can't just say Egyptian, even though no one can read it. I've got to say Reformed Egyptian. I know we've all said maybe it's because he believed that languages change over time, but that's pretty sophisticated of Joseph to go, no, people once they figure out how languages really work in another 100 or so years, they're going to call me on the fact that languages drift or change over time. So I have to invent a derivative of a known undecipherable language for the critiques that are going to come by linguists in the 20th century.
I think perhaps it's simpler. It's simply a case of it is unknown currently. Other ancient languages have been discovered and translated. If Egyptian is, then I've got a safety net in saying, well, it's not normal Egyptian, it's reformed Egyptian.
So you're saying he's looking around the corner as a prophet might and say...
it's a safety net, it's an extra line in case his rope breaks.
In case, but see, he didn't produce the plates. No. So in his mind, no one would have had any way. I mean, because no one was able to see the plates, talk about unfalsifiable. It's a language that no one can read that actually doesn't exist on plates that he's not going to show anyone. But see, that your answer, Nemo, assumes that Joseph thinks people are going to, Egyptologists are not only going to decipher the Egyptian, but also have access to the plates, which he probably knows don't exist, so no one would have access to them.
But then you have things like the characters document kicking around.
That's
so
what I keep thinking about.
There are have things like the characters document kicking around. So there are things that people can look at and try and fact check.
You're saying the one that Martin Harris took to
Mark Anton.
To Anton.
To Anton, yeah. Or Charles Anton, sorry.
Which I think Charles does say, Anton.
Yeah.
I think he does say that it had hieroglyphics on it. So people, for the apologists who want to say, oh, maybe it was demonic or whatever, I think he does say hieroglyphics. But
I mean, is that what Joseph is worried about? He chose Reformed Egyptian because he was worried that people would be trying to interpret the Anton manuscript?
We could be getting too deep on it, to be fair. He could have just picked it. there may not be a rhyme or reason to it.
I'm just saying it's worth thinking about.
It absolutely is.
It's extra trouble.
I wouldn't say he just picked it, but what I would say is there's a narrative reason for it, which is because he is writing to a Christian audience, Joseph Smith, and how knowing he was, I guess it's worth noting. I don't really see the model of Joseph Smith knowingly like making up the Book of Mormon, knowing that it was fake from the beginning. I just don't. There's too many things about Joseph Smith. I guess what I'm saying is I'm a big believer in Dan Vogel's pious fraud theory, because there are too many times when I look at the evidence that I think Joseph Smith is being sincere. In fact, one of the prime pieces of evidence we're going to look at here is Joseph Smith's work on the Kirtland Egyptian papers. Like, this was a serious effort that took a lot of time and drew his attention away. And so to me, the biggest explanation for why does Joseph Smith link Hebrew and Egyptian is because he probably knows that he needs to write it in a different language. We've got a plausible link between Egyptian and Hebrew, and how are we going to like make that link? Well, what he writes in First Nephi is that it's using Egyptian characters, but that it's still using the Hebrew language. So I think that's why he calls it Reformed Egyptian, is not because he's pre-apologizing knowing that people are going to figure out Egyptian someday. Maybe he might have thought about that, but I guess the way I see it is he's just saying this is the way that they dealt with Egyptian and Hebrew at the same time. So, because it always makes clear this is the language which is called by us Reformed Egyptian, and it's explaining that this is the way this language worked. So that's the way I'm picturing it, is not that it's some attempt to make something unfalsifiable. That's just a happy consequence, I guess, of the way he's telling the story.
Well, I want to invite our viewers and listeners to write in the comments of this episode if they have theories on what Joseph was thinking when he decided not to just say Egyptian, but to say Reformed Egyptian. Maybe you've got interesting theories. We'd love to hear them.
Yeah.
Maybe
absolutely.
Before we move on, I just want to say something that might be kind of random, but I want to do an LDS discussion on this topic, because I'm thinking of this Hebrew where it's dense, and then people say, there's chiasms. There's a lot of different Hebrew style of writing in the Book of Mormon, supposedly in the Book of Mormon text. You have like anaphora, which is like certain repetitions, or polysedenton, or different types. So like the Book of Mormon, written by Hebrew understanding people, written in Reformed Egyptian, then translated into Reformed Egyptian. Like I'm confused by how those Hebrew styles of writing were saved. Like
in Reformed Egyptian.
How those Hebrew people often point to one I've heard that I do think is actually compelling is the name Jershon. The name Jershon in Hebrew, if you were to translate it over, means like a place of inheritance or a place of blessing. And there's a story in the Book of Mormon about certain people being given this land of Jershon for an inheritance. I've often struggled with the same question, Julia, which is, why are we having these Hebrew forms, whether it's literary forms, names, why are they preserved at all in a tight literal translation, which is what the witnesses talked about, if the language these things are being written in the first place isn't even Hebrew? I do think that's a little bit of apologists playing Texas sharpshooter, like they're finding hits and counting hits that really shouldn't count, because if they're taking what the text says itself, we literally just read it. It says the Hebrew hath been altered by us also, and no man speaketh our language. So why are we finding chiasms in the Book of Mormon at all if it's being written in a form of Hebrew that's completely different from other forms of Hebrew? Is that your point?
That's exactly right. And then I think if I'm not mistaken, there are some chiasms in the Book of Abraham, which that doesn't make sense to me either, because like these are, and you can see with these, what we'll show is like a character can mean all these things, but like I'm just confused by how chiasms can be preserved at all. Like if it's a Hebrew understanding written in Reformed Egyptian or whatever, and then translated into English.
Into King James English.
And King James English. So like, I don't know, like I'm kind of curious to ask your linguist friend to see if can things be preserved like that?
Well, yeah, because I would imagine that when you have things like, I'm trying to think of very specific stylistic things like the haiku in Japanese literature, or the limerick in English, right? There are things about that come from the language that create those styles of writing. There's something about the Japanese language, about its flow, about the way people speak it, the way people relate to it, that means that form of poetry is beautiful to them. If you were to do that in English, haikus still kind of work in English, but I would imagine, I don't speak Japanese, but I imagine there is something missing if you as a native Japanese speaker hear a haiku in Japanese, there's something there that's missing when you translate it into English. And similarly, there's probably something missing when you take chiasmus or chiasms and put them into Reformed Egyptian. And so the question is then, why would they still try and preserve that literary style in that different language?
Well, and my question too, because we talked about at the beginning of this episode, a lot of recent apologetic framing is basically that the Book of Mormon is a revelation. It doesn't have to be a tight literal translation. And my question is, then why are apologists still counting these hits? If the Book of Mormon is more a conceptual translation, you shouldn't be able to count the hits.
Yeah, it's about the types of evidence people are looking for. Right. I've been speaking about this a lot recently. It's like, okay, you want to put forward witnesses for the Book of Mormon, fine. Then the plates have to be something that were someone to witness them that would count as evidence. So when you have Ballard saying, even if you had the plates, you wouldn't believe it, you're like, right, okay, so what is the point of witnesses then? And similarly, okay, if the Book of Mormon is a loose translation, is not a tight translation, then why are we still counting hits as though it is? Why are we still saying, well, this is evidence that it is exactly as it ought to be? It's loose or it isn't, I guess.
Right. Instead of just having like one cohesive theory that's consistent. Yes, they often are not picking up both ends of the stick at the same time.
Yeah.
They want to count those, like those, I'll just use chiasms. They want to count chiasms as a hit. But if you're someone who subscribes to the model of the Book of Mormon as a conceptual translation, those things shouldn't be a hit at all because it's a looser translation. The only way they would be preserved is if it's a tight literal translation. Mm-hmm. And to your example, Julia, I don't know there are chiasms in the Book of Abraham. I've never looked at that specifically, but there are chiasms all over the Doctrine and Covenants. And I recently was talking with Dr. Randy Bell at Thrive about his theory of where he thinks chiasms came from in the Book of Mormon. And in my view, I mean, Randy's work on that is interesting. In my view, chiasms are easy enough to explain from the point of view of Joseph Smith read a lot of the King James Bible, and he thought that the King James Bible language is the way that the language of Scripture sounded. We can obviously see that from the Doctrine and Covenants in the Book of Mormon. And I think the explanation is just as simple as the language of the King James Bible uses a lot of repetitive language that follows a certain form, and Joseph Smith was trying to mimic that form, and I think that's, in my mind, the easiest explanation.
Yeah, we can go into this more when we go talk about this, but I think Jack Welch was the first person to discover those, and the reason he discovered chiasms, or was first learning about them, is because he went to a seminar or whatever where this guy was talking about the New Testament, and the chiasm is present in there. And if Joseph Smith is using the New Testament, the King James Version, as his primer in school as a child, he of course is going to be exposed to these. So of course they're going to end up in the Book of Mormon. So to me, that's not, that's not hit at all. But just this idea of this language where it's like Hebrew style, translated to Reformed Egyptian, translated into English, it's still preserved somehow.
We got to do a chiasm episode, even if it's short.
We'll do it twice, once forward.
Yeah, exactly. Beat me to it there, Colby.
Thank you.
Don't we have three, like at the beginning and then the middle?
That's right. The most important episode will be in the middle. That's right. All the good stuff. People can just watch that one. That's right. Going back to this information density. So I think we've asked a lot of really interesting questions about this. But I think the real takeaway that we're going to look at now is looking at Joseph Smith's understanding of Egyptian based on certain documents in the Kirtland Egyptian papers. And I will say, I think the church deserves a lot of credit for its work on the Joseph Smith papers and making this material available. Another resource that I would point people to, I'll just say real quickly, my pet theory for why the church has been so transparent in the Joseph Smith papers is because before the Joseph Smith papers, the thing that even pro-Mormon scholars would have to cite to so often was Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents series. And I think the church was a little tired of people citing to someone who does not view Joseph Smith as a prophet. And I would recommend for people who want a deeper dive on just the documents involved in the Book of Abraham's translation and the Kirtland Egyptian papers, I would point people to Dan Vogel's book on Book of Abraham Apologetics. I think that's the title of it. Book of Abraham Apologetics, a Response and Critique, I think is what it is. But Dan does a great job of walking through and introducing the documents themselves so that you can understand. On this next slide, I've got from the Book of Abraham's actual manuscript. So there are 3 different versions of the Book of Abraham manuscript. So this is like the the manuscript written by the scribes who were taking notes as Joseph Smith engaged in this translation project. These parts are from July to November of 1835. The first manuscript is written by Frederick G. Williams, one of the scribes. The second is written by Warren Parrish. And what I really want people to see here is I've pulled the same excerpt from these from both of these manuscripts. The English text is translated as, "I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood, according to the appointment of God, unto the fathers concerning the seed." And I've got that in the first manuscript in Frederick G. Williams' handwriting on the top and in Warren Parrish's handwriting on the bottom.
That's kind of wild. Joseph loved this project so much. He's got 2 scribes.
3 at some point.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Like,
to your point.
When apologists try and minimize it, look at the amount of effort he's putting into it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And Joseph Smith absolutely believed he was engaged in the process of translation. That's not to say he didn't believe there was a revelatory aspect to it, but for apologists today who want to act like those are just 2 completely separate things, they weren't. And they weren't to Joseph and they weren't to the scribes. And you can see that when you actually read these manuscripts and when you read the journal entries from this time period. This was a serious effort that they were engaged in for multiple years, like over the course of multiple years. Because
while
it was
also running from the law, while also, all these other things going on. Like, it's a busy time in Mormonism, and he's spending a significant portion of it dealing with this.
Especially when they get to Nauvoo. He had a lot of things that were keeping him
he's
busy.
tied to seership because the Doctrine and Covenants says that's one of his main gifts.
Right.
In fact, that was his only original gift.
Oh, yeah.
And then it was changed to add, prophet and revelator.
And
after,
the Book of Mormon.
Right?
The Book of Mormon specifically says that a seer is greater.
Yeah. So he's got to be a seer.
Exactly.
Which at the time meant peeper, right? Seer stone user. Yeah.
And what you can see here, if we pull up the manuscripts one more time, is you can see that phrase, that entire sentence, in both of these manuscript versions, you've got an Egyptian character off to the left. You have one character or like one grouping of characters that is then translated into this entire sentence. Based on what we looked at with Egyptian earlier, this just simply isn't the way that Egyptian worked.
Why are there different characters between the 2 passages there?
I think that note on the bottom one is actually I think they are the same character. The bottom one just added like an additional flourish, or maybe that was some line. But what I'm seeing is almost like a backwards 4, but without the bottom line. Parrish's version does add like a little, almost like the tail of a Y on the end of it. So I'm not sure why
It almost looks like
they're
an
slightly
ampersand.
different, but they are similar, I guess.
Okay.
But again, to the point I'd made earlier, and I think it's worth reiterating here, what you would have to believe with no magical worldview or any spiritual worldview or revelatory worldview is that people in a functional language were able to know that one symbol meant all this.
The one in the top left of each of these boxes
means
meant all the lines of text.
I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the fathers concerning the seed. Now, maybe to play devil's advocate, perhaps in certain religious circumstances where the same phrase is said over and over again, you might shorthand it to that extent.
Right.
If there was a certain ceremonial or ritual expression that, in a religious service, people would see that in a book of mass, like a missal or something, and go, that's what that means, and they've memorized it. But as a functional language, with all the different ways that we communicate day to day about all these different things, and particularly because the Book of Abraham isn't a mass or a religious ceremony that's been written down, it is an account, it is a history that contains various details and various things like that, a more narrative approach. To have a conversational or narrative language that functions in that way is borderline impossible outside of a revelatory or a religious view or any of those sorts of things.
Right. And to make that point, if we pull that slide up one more time. So the English text is translated as, I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the fathers concerning the seed. Just imagine changing one of those words. Imagine instead of it saying, I sought for mine appointment, it's you sought for your appointment. How exactly are you going to delineate that on that character?
It's a whole new character.
It
would have to be a whole new character.
Exactly, which to your point just makes this language completely impractical to use.
The amount you would have to learn.
Can you imagine?
It's incredible.
For all the different verb tenses or possible pronoun combinations.
Yeah, just every one of these has just a pronoun table, and that's a new symbol for every single one. There's a reason to our knowledge, no language has ever worked that way. And it's because no one would ever because language is an outgrowth of speech. We talked about it earlier, they've changed it according to the way they speak. Written language is just a way of recording the way that we speak to one another.
How would they capture plural words?
Yeah,
How would they
no one's coming up with this way of capturing it because it's just deeply impractical and not intelligible.
Yeah, to drive it a little further home, I want to know what the character that says, I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the mothers would look like. That's the level of specificity that we're talking about. It's the no tail. Yeah. To make this a little bit clearer too, let's go to the next slide and you can see an even more egregious example. Here we've got a selection of, I see two characters. There's like a circle and a little dot. There's an underlining and there's something that looks like a backwards Y. You literally have an entire paragraph of English text that the scribes are writing down that Joseph has translated from this. And kind of sarcastically, I added our example of his back from the Tale of Two Brothers.
It's like a penguin and two feathers.
One 3-letter word takes 3 symbols in hieroglyphics.
Yes.
And Joseph is giving us an entire paragraph from maybe a couple of symbols.
Yes.
This is wild.
And it keeps going. We've got more examples on the next page.
All right.
You can see here. So here you at least have, I'm counting 4, maybe 5 symbols. I can't tell if they're completely separated. But again, we've got an entire paragraph of text. And again, when we look at the way Egyptian hieroglyphics really worked, the word brother, you've got multiple different characters to just get out that one word, brother. Think about what that means.
Yeah.
One of the words on the first example that we used was the word father. Those are equivalent levels of meaning because they're about a role in a family. Brother takes multiple characters, and yet fathers was one of the English words translated in an entire sentence from one character. This just simply isn't the way Egyptian worked.
I mean,
these characters that Joseph Smith is translating, they're the ones that come from the papyri, correct? So these we know what these should say. That's the other thing. We know what small words these do say because Robert Rittner, you've done an excellent long series with him covering what this actually says. So it's not even like he's making up characters and saying this is Reformed Egyptian here. He's just looking at actual Egyptian. And this is his view of that language. And so perhaps he thinks that Reformed Egyptian is even more information dense. Maybe that's the way he's going there.
I mean, it's just the biggest tell. We know how Joseph Smith viewed the Egyptian language, and then we know how the Book of Mormon explains its perception of the density of the Egyptian language. How do you explain it? It's Joseph was the author.
Yeah, and I honestly, so I've been, as you know, John, I've been working on this idea for like the last several years and noodling on it. I legitimately have no idea what the apologetic would be to this, because this is not like the numbers of deaths that are recorded in the Book of Ether or disputes about where the Hill Cumorah might be, even between believers. To me, this is a bigger problem. Because again, if we go back to that first slide, the Ouroboros image or the disappearing Moroni, these are claims in the Book of Mormon about why the Book of Mormon exists as a physical artifact in reality. And those claims that the Book of Mormon makes about the reason and the way it was written, they simply aren't true. And the bigger problem, like you just talked about, is not only are those things not true, they demonstrate the exact same misunderstanding or misapprehension of the way that the Egyptian worked that we know that Joseph Smith had for a fact, because there are documents that were written in that Kirtland Egyptian period or in the Kirtland Egyptian papers that are in Joseph Smith's own handwriting. You just have to look closely and you will see that Joseph Smith wrote some of those things even in his own handwriting.
I do know what the apologetic response to this would be, Colby. Do you want to know what it is?
That I'm in danger of hellfire.
It's that you, Colby, are either gay or cheated on your wife.
Honey, I'm sorry you had to find out this way.
Am I wrong?
I don't know, or that I'm too skeptical. I've heard stuff like that before.
Michael Quinn was gay, and Simon Southerton, they tried to say he was unfaithful. I mean, that's how they do it.
I'm sorry, Cammie, that you had to find out this way.
But I think a broader point there, John, is they will just resort to ad hominem, right? They will just attack you personally. Point. Yeah, exactly.
Or Brett Metcalf was a butthead.
Oh,
Do you remember that?
Oh my
I
gosh.
do.
That was so dumb.
Calling
So
people
mature.
a butthead for Jesus is just top marks. No
Buttheads
notes.
for Jesus. We need merch, John. We need T-shirts. Buttheads for Jesus.
Because you can't argue that this is revelation, right? Because this is this is the character that means these things in reality.
How would that even? So they will argue that it was revelation, and Joseph Smith's journal
catalyst
entries
theory.
do talk about him receiving revelation, but I don't see how that helps, because when they say revelation, what they're saying is we shouldn't expect it to line up like an actual translation, but that is very much not what Joseph Smith understood. Joseph Smith understood that while he was translating with the help of God, it's not like he viewed it like
With the help
catalyst
of a
theory.
magic stone.
With the help
and
of the
God.
magic stone.
But he
and
didn't do it like the catalyst theory. You're right. What he did do was he said, I'm going to translate this ancient language and God will help me do it.
Exactly.
That's that magical worldview I was talking about earlier, or that
Yes.
spiritual worldview. Through the power of God, I can decipher the meaning of these small characters into the larger paragraphs, the meaning that they contain, that are only revealed by someone who, like me, has the gift of being a seer, has the gift of being a translator, etc.
Right.
That was Joseph Smith's view of this.
Right. And he went to a lot of effort to producing these materials that viewed, like even through Revelation, to Julia's point, he viewed what he was doing as a literal translation of the Egyptian language. So much so that he actually produced, or scribes produced with his approval, the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language during this period. So if we can pull up that slide, Nemo, would you read that for us?
Sure. Joseph Smith and his associates retained the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language volume and later used it several times in 1842 and 1843. The volume was used extensively when Joseph Smith and his associates published Facsimile 2 and its accompanying explanation in March 1842,
And just
which
for people-
remains in canonized LDS scripture.
Correct. And just for people who don't understand, the facsimiles are part of the Book of Abraham.
Yeah.
So that was one of the figures. Facsimile 2, excuse me, facsimile 2 is what's known as a hypocephalus. So it was a circular disc that was placed below the head of one of the mummies. And so it then does make its way into scripture, like you said.
And the hypocephalus is one of the things that Joseph Smith bought off Chandler.
Yes.
And he tried to fill in some of the blanks with his own information. But that
Incorrectly.
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 But that information
Incorrectly, he did that, yes.
But that information is still within canonized LDS scripture, that image and its explanation.
Well, part of it was taken out of canonization. I'm just joking.
Parts were taken out, put back, taken out, put back. Min lost and gained several times. The
He also
god Min.
castrated God, which
That's
is
what I-
That's
what I was
what we're
referring
talking
to.
about. We're talking about Min lost his member and then got it back and then lost it again.
what if God minded
For
being
people who might
castrated?
not know what we're talking about, there is the Egyptian god Min, is one of the figures that's in this facsimile number 2, and he is featured at one time and originally
Traditionally.
depicted with an erect penis, and that penis is then removed in one version of the scriptures and then added back in the 1981 version of the scriptures and the subsequent editions of the scriptures today.
Indeed.
So
So it's all just a little bit of carry-on humor there. But the following spring, back to the slide, 6 brass plates were dug out of an Indian burial mound near Kinderhook, Illinois, and brought to Nauvoo, Illinois, for Joseph Smith to translate. One of the men who unearthed the plates had manufactured them and planted them in a mound to deceive local Mormons. According to one source, Joseph Smith looked at the plates and then compared them with his Egyptian alphabet, an apparent reference to the grammar and alphabet volume. So we've done a whole episode on the Kinderhook plates and that incident, so we don't really need to get into it here. But the point is, when Joseph Smith was presented with what he believed to be an ancient artifact, he, as a prophet, as a seer, as a translator, referenced this document. So we're establishing here the primacy of this document in Joseph Smith's functioning in his way of moving about the world.
Exactly. And that's why I thought it was a good companion to Julia's question is this is why I don't think the revelation or saying Joseph Smith viewed this as a revelation. Like, yes, I'll concede that's true. Joseph Smith's journals absolutely talk about him having an unfolding from God of like this cosmological system that's in the Book of Abraham. I just don't see how that helps because the way that Joseph Smith engaged with the materials that he produced, he very much viewed it as a literal translation of the Egyptian language. That's why when the Kinderhook plates are brought to him, he goes and he looks for a character that matches what the work that he and the scribes have already done. And even the folks at the Joseph Smith Papers Project understand this. What you just read comes from the Joseph Smith Papers, probably the source note or maybe the historical introduction to the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. But even they concede that though Joseph Smith's handwriting isn't in the grammar and alphabet alphabet of the Egyptian language, just some of the other documents, they say, it is likely that Joseph Smith knew and approved of the work that Phelps and Parrish were doing in compiling this grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. And I wanted to throw this in as a little bonus. So if we go to that first...
I just have to say, you can't make this up. Joseph takes fake plates that were falsely created to fool him, and then compares those fake false plates with this totally erroneous Egyptian and grammar alphabet, which we know is completely false, and then makes a completely false conclusion that there is a connection between these completely problematic documents. This, you can't make this up. This stuff, it's like the blind leading the blind leading the blind.
It sure is. I think that is the best way to put it. But a seer is
three
choice
blind
above
mice
all.
in a conga line.
That's right.
A seer is what?
I said, but a seer is choice above all, as the Book of Mormon tells us. So one of the things that's really interesting about this grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language is that it goes through and establishes different levels of degrees of meaning in the Egyptian language. Let me just start by saying that's complete nonsense. That's not the way that Egyptian worked. It didn't have different degrees of meaning. So if we pull up that next slide, you can see that this is Joseph Smith basically talking about the fifth degree, or the Joseph and the scribes, I guess, working out how Egyptian worked. And the way that they saw it is like you could have a character that had a little thing added to it that increased its degree. So whether it was underlined or you added an extra circle or something, you were basically furthering the meaning along the same lines by working up in degrees. So like the first degree might be a father, and fifth degree might be like God the Father of everything. And at a simple level, like this is just not the way Egyptian worked.
What year is this?
This page specifically?
Or just this.
Are you
the
make a
project.
Masonic
He's
connection?
working this out in...
Is this Nauvoo time period or Kirtland? Nauvoo or Kirtland?
He would have started in Kirtland, but I don't think it was finished until Nauvoo.
Because I'm just wondering, right?
Yeah.
This idea of progressing in degrees feels very Masonic.
Yeah, it does.
I'm wondering how deeply integrated Joseph Smith is with Freemasonry at this point, if he's talking about things being revealed in degrees, which is a very Masonic idea that you have information added as you go through the degrees.
Yeah.
That's a good question. That's a good point.
Yeah, that is a good point. I haven't looked at it under that lens.
Tell us in the comments.
Yeah, I think the thing that is really interesting is that like Mandarin Chinese, Nemo, you referenced that earlier, has tones. So you might have the same word or something that sounds very similar, but the tone in which it is said changes the meaning.
Yes.
And so I can see that some languages work this way, but Egyptian did not work this way. And the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language basically builds upon this idea.
So the famous example is ma and ma. I can't get the tones right.
Ma.
Yeah, right. Ma, the sound, said four different ways. One of them means mother, one of them means horse.
Yes.
So you can get that very wrong in context if you're not careful.
So Joseph was a prophet, basically. Is what
Cantonese has 9
just
tones.
about the wrong language. Yes.
But just about the wrong language, because that's not how Egyptian works. And the degrees of meaning I don't think is the same thing as tones necessarily.
Yeah. Right, pronunciations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So then I think we have a few more examples kind of specific characters. And Julie, I think you might have added these.
Yeah, so this is the same thing you just saw. I just blew it up so that you could see very clearly, this is the symbol and this is what it means. And this is just wild to me. And like thinking about the Book of Mormon.
Read it. So
the whole thing?
Yeah.
So this it looks almost like an eye, like a closed eye to me is what someone's eyeball. I don't know how to say these people's names. Katuman, a lineage with whom a record of the fathers was entrusted. Sorry, I left the spelling original. By tradition of him, and according to the tradition of their elders, by whom also the tradition of the art of the embalming was kept.
That's so brilliant.
It's
the
so
phrase
wild.
by whom also.
Julie, your point is?
Well, I was going to say, just like in the Book of Mormon, he stops the. So all the witnesses say that it was a tight translation from everything we can say. And they said if they spelled a name wrong, he would stop them and say he would correct them. Or if they missed a word, he would stop them and they would correct it. This doesn't make any sense because he's got a name in there. And how are you supposed to know if the person wrote it down wrong?
Oh, can we please go to the next one because it has multiple names?
Right, like that doesn't make any sense.
Can I read this one? Okay, we have ho e oop. Which this
One
is,
symbol. For
This
those
is one
listening.
symbol that kind of looks like an axe on its side.
It looks like Oklahoma.
Yeah, it does a little bit look like Oklahoma, yeah.
Oh, the state.
So,
This little symbol that looks like Oklahoma says,
Ho-e-oop, a prince of the royal blood, a true descendant from Ham, the son of Noah, and inheritor of the kingly blessings from under the hand of Noah, but not according to the priestly blessing, because of the transgressions of Ham, which blessing fell upon Shem from under the hand of Noah. Methinks perhaps he's making this up.
There are three proper names in there. Think about what that means. You have three proper
But
names
repeated lots of times.
in one. You have a subjunctive clause in there. So to have a subjunctive clause,
That's what the line is. That's a subjunctive clause. And,
Is the apologetic for this that this is just the Book of Abraham? This isn't the gold plates. I'm just trying to figure out how you can respond to
it's
this.
that you're gay, Julia.
I just don't understand how people address this.
They don't.
Other than
They literally don't. They literally do not. They act like claiming that Joseph Smith was involved in a revelatory project makes all of this go away. When in my view, it actually makes it much worse. Because if Joseph Smith thinks he was getting these translations through revelation, the same way he thinks he's getting the translation of the Book of Mormon by revelation, and this is the one time we can fact check him, that is what poses a huge problem from my perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, shall we talk about
Those are great. Julia, those are great slides.
Thank you for blowing those up. Can we talk about kind of our conclusion of this second piece? And then I know Julia had a few more slides. So our conclusion from the second piece, I think we've already reiterated it a number of times, but it's that Joseph Smith's work on the Book of Abraham and the other Egyptian projects demonstrates that Joseph Smith shared the same exact incorrect belief about how Egyptian worked that the author of Mormon 9 possessed. Mm-hmm. So if we're engaged in hypothesis testing and we're trying to think which is more likely, is it more likely
the language works like we just described?
Yeah. Or perchance.
Is it more likely that you're going to believe everything about the way language works, multiple things about the way Egyptian works, or are you going to believe Joseph Smith's claims? I think it's as simple as that. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about this argument in general is that, again, these are the claims the Book of Mormon makes about the way it is written. So remember that framing of Back to the Future or Moroni disappearing in the dust, because if these claims aren't true, which I think we have shown pretty compelling case that they are not true, why does the Book of Mormon exist? Unless it is a fabrication or something coming directly from Joseph Smith. Even if you believe Joseph Smith was sincerely deluded in coming up with this, I think it is clear that we can trace this claim in the Book of Mormon back to Joseph Smith and nobody else.
Because we do have to accept that it exists, right? It is here. We can read it. We can look at it. So it's come into existence somehow. And so the question is, how?
I will just say I really like when I interviewed John Hamer, just the brilliant scholar who now is with Community of Christ. Mm-hmm. He always would say to me, not only could Joseph have written the Book of Mormon, he would always say there's no one but Joseph Smith that really could have written the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. And in my interpretation of today's episode, this is a really good example of what John Hamer was saying. You need someone with an understanding that the language of Egyptian works in a way that not only is totally impossible and ridiculous, but is not true and makes no sense. You need someone who has that belief to have created the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, to put
who among us had that view? It was Joseph Smith.
To put a really fine point on it, Colby keeps saying Joseph Smith shares the same misapprehension about Egyptian that the author of Mormon 9? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mormon 9 has. That is to say, the conclusion seems to be that Joseph Smith is the author of Mormon 9. That seems the most likely conclusion based on this evidence, is that he is that author. That is why they share that same misapprehension.
It reminds me of the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat song, Who This Man Could Be, I Just Don't Know. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I love that musical.
And it's Joseph.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other thing I'm really struck by is, because there's so many historicity problems for the Book of Mormon, apologists have been forced to basically treat it like they've treated the Book of Abraham. I think we're seeing a lot of apologetic movement that direction. And I think the other reason this episode is important to me is that Book of Mormon historicity is not something that can just be hand waved away. Joseph Smith has literal artifacts from the Book of Mormon that are in the narrative, like the interpreters, the Urim and Thummim, are physical artifacts that are recorded in the text of the Book of Mormon that then he later uses. The fact that he encountered the angel Moroni, someone that we've been talking about today, Mormon and Moroni both, as these redactors, in Joseph Smith's worldview, these people they existed. They were literal like personages, even though they were resurrected people. They were literal experiences that Joseph Smith recounted. And I think that's the reason that I don't think historicity as a problem for the Book of Mormon is going to get better, and I don't think it can be hand waved away. And so I guess the best like steelman version of the opposing view I can give is the Book of Mormon gives a separate test for what is good, what is true, basically whether it leads someone to Christ. And I don't want to take any of that away from people. If they feel like the Book of Mormon is scripture to them, I'm not trying to take that away. I think this episode to me just shows, though, we can't view it as a historical record based upon feelings, because how we determine whether it's a historical record is by looking at the types of questions we looked at today. And like we've looked at in our brass plates and Great Isaiah Scroll episode, the Stone Box episode, when we look at these things from the way we would look at settling historicity in literally any other arena of our life, the question would be kind of as you said it, Nemo.
Mm-hmm. I just, on the point of who Joseph Smith saw, what resurrected beings he encountered, I did a video the other day on taking people's Mormon hot takes. Mm-hmm. And it came that not only the Elisha problem in the Kirtland temple is an issue, in that they are the
same person.
The same person. They're the Greek or the Hebrew name for the same person. But also that if you talk to someone like Dan McClellan, he will tell you that the historical figure of Moses isn't real.
Right.
And yet Joseph encountered the resurrected Moses in the Kirtland temple. So who did he encounter? I think, again, when we start to look at these things from a historical perspective, we start to encounter more problems, not less. So just wanted to add that in as a little bonus.
Two things I wanted to say before we get to your last two slides, Julia. One is, we had a comment on the John Lundwall episode that kind of blew my mind. And the basic comment was that all the, let's just say, anti-Book of Mormon criticisms that we've seen, DNA, horses, steel, Deutero Isaiah, pick your top 10 most problematic or devastating critiques. They're kind of like rifle shots to specific parts of the Book of Mormon. But what John Lundwall's episode combined with, honestly, with today's episode, they're these macro comprehensive critiques of Book of Mormon authenticity and historicity that are absolute smoking guns and devastating to anyone who's honestly, sincerely reviewing the evidence. And again, it's not rifle micro shots. They're devastating to the whole
it burns the
narrative.
whole book down because the book shouldn't exist.
Well, and in fact, the reason that I came up with this approach to this episode, John, is when I was talking about historicity and archaeological evidence and talking about, it was as RFM and I, or Radio Free Mormon and I, were responding to the Light and Truth letter. We did an episode focused on archaeology and historicity, and I was talking about how the numbers of deaths recorded in the Book of Ether are literally like one of the largest battles that's ever happened in the entire world.
Yes.
Let alone
bigger than Stalingrad.
Bigger than Stalingrad, and we're talking with like pre-Columbian technology. So the fact that something like that is recorded as happening, it just simply is, it borders on impossible. And I was talking to an apologetic friend about that, and they were pointing out that like, well, but there is this pattern of ancient texts exaggerating the numbers. And so what got me thinking about this episode is, okay, if I had to pick one Book of Mormon problem that can't be explained away, it is the claims the Book of Mormon makes about the way the Book of Mormon was written. Mm-hmm. Because if those claims aren't literally historically true, the Book of Mormon shouldn't exist. Yeah. That's why I use that image of Moroni disappearing, because if these claims aren't true, which they aren't, the Book of Mormon should not exist.
As a historical document.
Correct.
Yes.
It can exist as a work of fiction, as a production of someone's whatever, but as a historical document.
Correct.
Shouldn't exist.
They were saying that the author was exaggerating the numbers?
Yeah, there are patterns in ancient texts of
Romans or whatever.
Yeah, Romans, Phoenicians, of exaggerating the numbers of soldiers who were involved in a conflict because they weren't writing from this goes back to John Lundwall's episode. They weren't writing from the perspective of recording literal history. They were writing things often in like a form of propaganda or a form of boasting, right? A lot of these wars between different tribes were literally a stand-in for my God is bigger than your God and can beat up your God. And in fact, we see a lot of that reflected in the Old Testament. So there is that pattern, but again, this is where we talked about apologists not picking up both ends of the stick. If you're going to pick up that side of the stick, it then begs the question, like, how much of the Book of Mormon cannot be literal before it just is entirely fiction or inspired pseudepigrapha, whatever approach you want to take. That's why I decided to focus my efforts on looking at the Book of Mormon of what claims in the Book of Mormon must be literally historically true. And if it's not these ones about how the Book of Mormon says it was written and how it came to be, then I don't know what else. If you're willing to hand wave away this, then you're willing to hand wave away anything, really, is my view.
And that's fine. Like if you're not actually concerned with the evidence and those sorts of things, then that's okay. But if you claim to be concerned with those things, then the follow through has to be that you have to kind of engage with them.
Sure.
I'll never forget, 10 or so years ago, I'm talking to one of the most famous Mormon scholars ever. I'll just say she was one of the 6 most famous Mormon scholars in the fall of 1993. Let's just put it that way.
I might be able to figure that out come September. Yeah.
So I'm talking to her because she's still a believer.
Yeah.
And so I was getting really upset about Book of Mormon historicity and the plates and the golden plates and the witnesses. And this was her explanation of making it all fit. She believes, according to my memory of what she said, that Joseph Smith was a prophet and that, Nephi and Laman and Lemuel and Laban and Moroni, they all did exist, but there weren't gold plates. But Joseph said there were gold plates, but that Joseph created fake plates to make people believe that there were gold plates. But that when he was translating, even though he knew that he didn't have the gold plates and that he created fake plates to fool people, when he was translating, he believed he was still channeling an ancient civilization in his creation of the Book of Mormon. So she believes all of that at once.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. Okay.
I'm not joking. I've got it in writing where she explains this to me. So, it's the pious fraud that Joseph, no, there wasn't golden plates because that story is ridiculous. And yes, he had to create fake plates to fool everybody. But he still believed that there was a Moroni and a Nephi and the,
Why did he have to fool everybody if there were no why couldn't he have just said he's channeling
people
it?
Needed some physical, just like people needed some artifacts to be able to believe a story so ridiculous. Even though the story was true, they weren't going to believe it unless they could feel some tangible.
Blessed are ye because you believe and have not seen.
Wait, are you telling me this explanation doesn't make sense?
Well, Jesus was a big fan of people believing without seeing things, and so the idea that Joseph had to lie to people to give them something to
I'm just
see,
saying
to
that's
believe,
what this well-respected, believing Mormon scholar believes.
Yeah, and when we get to those types of explanations, again, I'm never trying to take away faith from people. I think
No.
Yeah, and I think the main reason I engage in like this type of analysis is I simply want to help people, especially even believers, understand why historicity is a requirement for me to believe in the Book of Mormon. I believed in the Book of Mormon because I believed it was historical, because that's the way I was always taught. That's the way Joseph Smith understood it. I'm not trying to take away from people who see it differently, but that story and just how difficult it is to believe that theory makes me think of this quatrain from Omar Khayyam. It's more generally about Revelation, but I hope I can get it correctly. He says, "And do you think that unto such as you, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew, God gave a secret and denied it me. Well, what matters it? Believe that too." And I just think about that. Like at a certain point when we get to Revelation as the answer, I can't like take someone else's revelatory experience. I just can't. Like, that's their experience. And so if they feel like that's the truth or that's what they want to base their lives on, I can understand that. But
of course,
for me,
and to be clear, my point wasn't to mock this person, to make fun of their beliefs. It's to say what type of pretzel intellectually you have to bend your brain into to make all of this make sense. Bless that person for their belief. Bless everyone who has beliefs. If it helps you live a better life, believe it, right? But it's just an illustration of what you have to do.
Yeah,
if
we're asking the question, how could you possibly believe that? That's one of the ways in which you can.
That's how you do it.
Right, should we talk about how Joseph Smith
so there's a couple more slides. So when you and I were going over this earlier this week, I was wondering where did Joseph get this idea that you could fit so much into so little? And I think you've even mentioned.
Wait, don't tell me he borrows it from somebody else.
Right. Wow. So I looked a lot to try to find a good quote from these different people that were publishing in the 1820s to see if I could find one that fit really well.
Love it.
So one of them was from Thomas Young, and he published a book called An Account of Some Recent Discoveries in Hieroglyphical Literature in Egyptian Antiquities.
In what year?
In 1823. Right. And so the thing is, I was looking, that book is on archive.org, you can look at it, but I couldn't find like a really good quote. But so there's another person that wrote it, this is going to sound really weird. This person wrote an article in 2019, and her name is Sarah Gillam. And so that I'm pulling this quote from her understanding of his book, if that makes sense, because I really liked how she kind of summarized his work. Does somebody actually want to read Sarah's quote?
Sure. Hieroglyphs were used by Egyptians for thousands of years, but following the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great and the imposition of Hellenistic rule, the script gradually ceased to be used. Roman and Greek authors, who could not read hieroglyphs, believed them to be symbolic and not phonetic, a belief which went unquestioned and effectively hampered decipherment for centuries.
Thank you. And that article was called Thomas Young and the Decipherment of Hieroglyphics. So she's specifically talking about his understanding. So it's a symbolic, not phonetic, and this belief went unquestioned for years. And so I thought that one did a really good job of showing what Joseph could be understanding of the Egyptian language. This other one, the second one that I found, is not as clear, but it was a book that was written in 1742 by William Warburton. And I won't say the title of it. It's just super long. The Divine, it's just all right there if you want to throw it up on the screen.
I'm going to read that out. Hang on.
Okay.
The divine legation of Moses demonstrated on the principles of a religious deist from the omission of the doctrine of a future state of reward and punishment in the Jewish dispensation.
That's a book title?
That's a book title.
Okay.
And he says, the common foundation, and his emphasis, not mine, the common foundation of writing and speaking was a picture or image presented to the imagination through the eyes and ears. And kind of what I was getting from that is that it's the same idea where it's like, it's a picture or an image, and then by your imagination, you can figure out the translation of that. And so I think those were at least some good examples. And then I found a lot of, how do you say his name? Champollion. Yeah, and I did find other scholars that were pushing against this idea that this doesn't make sense for this symbol to mean so much. I can't remember those specifically, but I put them in the show notes as well, that people were being critical, but people were accepting that understanding that Joseph Smith latched onto and then created the Book of Mormon and then created the Book of Abraham. So I just thought those were good.
Sounds like a good master's thesis or doctoral dissertation.
You could have a whole, for real.
The other thing that's really interesting is that Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith receives the Egyptian material that he gets from Michael Chandler. And one thing that's really interesting is that Michael Chandler, when he sells Joseph Smith those materials in Kirtland, he gives Joseph Smith a certificate. And it's really interesting to me from the point of view of Nemo. Earlier, you talked about, different types of evidence or how people look at different types of evidence. I'm going to read that certificate, and people can find this on the Joseph Smith papers. It's dated July 6th, 1835. Chandler writes, "This is to make known to all who may be desirous concerning the knowledge of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. in deciphering the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic characters in my possession, which I have, in many eminent cities shown to the most learned. And from the information that I could ever learn or meet with, I find that of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. to correspond in the most minute matters." My point here is just that Joseph Smith obviously believed that he was actually engaging with Egyptian, and so did other people in Joseph Smith's worldview. It's kind of funny with Michael Chandler in the sense that Michael Chandler stood to make a profit off of telling Joseph Smith what he wanted to hear, but it's just significant to me that it lines up with the quotes you found also, Julia.
Yeah.
Wow. What a great episode, y'all.
Yeah.
Nice work.
Yeah, this is really good.
It's been a long time coming, so I'm glad we were able to do this one. Thanks for having us, John.
Yeah. So is LDS Discussions going to continue? Are y'all still?
For sure.
Oh, yeah. We've got episodes in the works. We've got slides we're working on.
Mm-hmm.
Any possible themes?
The next idea I think we have slated to talk about is all of the times that frauds, like knowing frauds, were directly incorporated into kind of the overall Mormon narrative and myth.
So think Hoffman, think Kinderhook, that sort of stuff.
And then even modern ones, which I would include as like Hildebrand, who she's meeting with general authorities.
Ballard.
Yeah.
Tim Ballard.
And to me, that kind of speaks to even just the certificate we just looked at from Michael Chandler. It speaks to what happens to you epistemologically when you are so determined to reach a certain conclusion. One of the things I want to incorporate in that episode is the time that Dallin Oaks, in response to Mark Hoffman writing the White Salamander letter, prepped the membership of the church at an apologetics conference to just wholly accept a white salamander being the origins of the Moroni story.
So all the times church leaders were fooled, basically?
Yeah, but specifically looking at the lens of what happens when we want a certain conclusion so badly that we ignore all of the red flags.
Yeah,
and
I think it's the opposite of what Gerald Tanner did. When Hoffman's forgeries came up, he had more reason than anyone to want them to be true, and he stood his ground and said, no, I don't think they passed the sniff test.
So Mormon-motivated reasoning, basically. Yeah. Fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again, just to remind everyone, this LDS discussion series exists. It's enjoyed best in sequence. So you can check out the playlist LDS Discussions on YouTube under the Mormon Stories podcast channel. You can check it out as its own podcast on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, or you can, enjoy it integrated into the traditional Mormon Stories podcast feed. It's also always worth mentioning, I'm sure you all mention this every time, that the idea, the origins of the LDS Discussion series is the honorific Mike, who now TikToks on other topics. But back in the day, he wrote an amazing website called LDS Discussions. And the original 60 or 70 episodes of this series were with Mike from his website and from his writings. And please do check out ldsdiscussions.com for Mike's original work. We always give honor and praise. If we're going to give honor and praise to anyone, it should be Mike, right?
That's right. Praise to the man who wrote the website.
And always, I'll just end by saying, if you value this series and want to see it continue, we pay everyone here for their work, along with other post-production work behind the scenes. So please do donate to Mormon Stories Podcast. You can go to mormonstories.org/donate, become a monthly donor. And that will allow us to afford to keep doing this series, because obviously this is one of the most expensive series that we do, because we're paying 3 to 4 people to do it instead of no one, or just 1 or 2. And while you're donating to Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation, you can also donate to Nemo the Mormon via what?
Via donorbox.org/Nemo the Mormon.
And you can donate to Analyzing Mormonism, Julia's channels. How?
Yeah, you can go to my website, analyzingmormonism.com. There's a section donate, and you can just do that there if you want it.
All right. And Colby, how do people give you money?
Just send your money right now to John. That is completely fine with me. Please do support this series if it's important to you. I really appreciate John hosting these discussions on his channel, and I think we'll continue to look at it as long as there's interest. Look at topics like this as long as there's interest. So please support that way.
And please give us your comments on YouTube or Spotify. We love your comments, questions, criticisms. We love it all if it's thoughtful and not ad hominem. But we're pretty much all gay. I think we've established one thing for sure. Right? Which is that all 4 of us are gay.
One of us
and
really
that we cheat.
One of us really is gay.
And you'll have to figure out who that is, right? What did you say, Colby?
I said, and that we all cheat also.
Yeah. We're cheaters and we're gay. Yeah. We're gay cheaters because we criticize the church sometimes. Anyway, I don't know. How did I get there? I don't even know. But
John, you got to land that. You can land it. I believe in you.
I'll just say thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories. Thanks for all your support. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. Oh, we want your feedback. So when you make comments on YouTube, we prefer that you not leave ad hominem comments, but instead substantive comments or criticisms, but we welcome them anyway. Email us. Give us your feedback. If you have ideas of topics you want us to cover on the LDS Discussion series, you can email me at mormonstories@gmail.com. I'll share them with the group, and maybe we'll do your topic as well. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Colby. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Nemo.
Pleasure.
Thanks for coming all the way to our studios today. We should have planned more, having us all four here.
We should have.
But I'm glad we got today done. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you all again soon on another episode of LDS Discussions and Mormon Stories podcast. Take care, everybody.